Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend Caller. What if with another fiction? What if Deku journey to become green hair dragon? Now, before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now, let's get into the fanfic. The next day, Class 1 sat with brimming excitement as they awaited their first heroic lesson of the school year. For most of the class, the day had gone by like they were in any other school. The lessons were what one would call fairly standard, with things like art history, English, math, classical literature, and so on. The only difference was who was teaching them. The heroes. For Izuku, he sat in every class doing his best to contain the utter joy he felt until he was vibrating with excitement. Literally. And due to his new dragon abilities, his vibrations destroyed his desk more than once. This led to some interesting conversations with the staff. "Oh my," cooed Midnight when Izuku's desk fell apart, one of the screws somehow embedding itself into the wall. "Looks like someone is happy to see me." The older woman then licked her lips in a manner that caused most of the class to shiver and blush. Izuku, on the other hand. "You have no idea," he exclaimed with his hands balled up into fists, while standing next to the remains of his desk, waiting for the robots to return to repair and reinforce it. Again. Still, he stood there looking at the woman with stars, rather than lusty hearts, in his eyes. "You're Nimiri Kayama, the pro-hero Midnight. You hold one of the highest records in Japan for the least amount of property damage and villain injury. In fact, I think how you took down the Grand Tailor bank robber was a perfect showcase on why your quirk is so amazing." "Do you now?" purred Midnight, gently placing 2 fingers over her lips, giving the teen a sultry look as she leaned against the teacher's desk. However, while everyone else blushed and looked away, Izuku didn't seem fazed. "Oh my. Do any of my other students remember that one?" "No." "Oh, you're all such naughty boys and girls." "Midoriya, do you mind recounting that story for the class?" "Of course," replied Izuku, stars still his eyes as he nodded. Grand Tailor had a quirk called Blood Thread. By mixing his blood with various threads to create clothing, he could take control of their movements for a certain amount of time. But it was only the parts of the body that were covered, and it had a time limit based on the amount of blood used. He managed to add some of his specially made threads into security guard uniforms of certain banks, forcing them to wear gloves in order to gain control of their hands. Then he would rob them and use his captives as human shields. Only, on his last job, he chose the city where your agency was located. Rather than bursting through the door, Midnight managed to get into the air duct system, where she then used her quirk. Everyone practically fell asleep at the same time. "Lame," muttered Bakugo. "Oh yes," cried Midnight as she began to hold herself, body trembling as she began to sway. "Such a good boy you are." Her cries, and the tone she used, had a certain effect on her students, many of whom began to leak blood out of their noses. None more so than Minta. "No!" cried the grape-themed teen as his nosebleed began to go out of control, one hand holding his nose while the other was doing its best to scoop up the life-giving liquid. "No. Stay in your home. Daddy needs you there to stay alive. It's also rumored that you and the pro-hero Best Jeanist might be a couple," continued Izuku, his tone indicating that he was one of the few students who had not been bothered at all by how Midnight was acting. Speaking of the woman, the pro-hero instantly froze as she looked at Izuku. "Though honestly, I don't put a lot of weight behind it. Just because you both donate to similar orphanages and are seen there together could be just a coincidence. Still, I really love the picture of you helping the children with their art projects. Helping those who really need a smile is something really heroic." "Oh, my desk is fixed." It was true. While Izuku was speaking, one of the many robots on campus had quickly repaired the desk. As he sat down, the entire class just watched him like he had grown a second head. Even Midnight had stopped in her antics, eyeing the green-haired boy with a slight blush on her cheeks, though that was mostly from embarrassment. "Midoriya," whispered Minta from behind the dragon teen, his skin looking a little pale due to blood loss. How? How are you not affected by the advances of such a sexy older woman? For a moment, Midoriya turned in his seat to look at Mainta before looking around at the rest of his classmates. The states they were in. Thankfully, most of the people who had nosebleeds had died down with only Kaminari and Mainta still having them. The rest had wiped them away, though Izuku, with his dragon senses, could still smell the blood in the air. He could also feel the heightened temperatures of his classmates, with a few of them even fanning themselves with their hands. The only one who didn't seem as affected was Bakugo, though he did have a slight tint of red on his cheeks. He then looked back at Midnight, who also seemed to be calming down, much faster than the rest of the class, before glancing up at the ceiling. Now that he thought about it, if this had been a year ago, he probably would have reacted the same. So why had he? Izuku's eyes then narrowed slightly as memories came back to him. Flashback. Here you go, Mr. Midoriya, giggled Toru. The pair were alone, sitting at the table back in his old apartment. The dragon maid was sitting right next to him, pressing her chest right into his arm, causing the poor boy to go rigid. In her hand, Toru held the chopsticks, having just blown on a large chunk of her tail meat with rice covering the top. Slowly, she brought it to his mouth, gently depositing it onto his tongue. So, she said in a whisper, her breath tickling his ear as he chewed. How do I taste tonight? Izuku then began to choke on his food. Another flashback. Izuku, what's this? Asked Kana. Izuku looked away from the mechanical pencil pack he was holding in his hand to see what the little dragon girl had brought him. She held the item in both hands like it was the most precious piece of all Might merchandise in existence. That's a pen, answered Izuku as he took the bulky item. It was a large, multi-ink colored type with the pro-hero hawks running along the side and waving at an imaginary audience. Briefly, Izuku wondered if she had wandered into the boys' section of the stationery supply shop they were in, or if someone had just put it there thinking that a staff member would put it away from them. Regardless, Izuku slipped out his damaged notebook. The same one that Kaken had exploded on both ends before tossing it out a window and into a pond. Quickly, he turned to a blank page that had no burn marks, but some minor water damage. Damaged, but still usable for something like this. After selecting the color pink, Izuku wrote Kana's name down before switching to green to write down his own. Finally, he ended with Toru's name in red. When Izuku showed what he had written to Kana, the young dragon girl's eyes began to sparkle. She then let out a low sound of excitement as she placed both her hands on her cheeks. That's so amazing, cried Kana. I know, but you can't use it for school, replied Izuku as the pen vanished in a blur from his hand. According to the list the school sent you, you can only use pencils. Either wooden ones or the mechanical ones. That's dumb, grumbled Kana as she began to pout. Just as Izuku was about to explain why this was, either because the teachers didn't want to deal with messy pages full of students scribbling over their mistakes or something, his notebook was shoved in his face. Look what I did, Mr. Midoriya, cried Toru. After pulling the notebook away from his face, Izuku could now clearly see that Toru had I love Mr. Midoriya over and over again with a heart drawn between each sentence. Seeing this, his face began to turn bright red. Even more so when he noticed the slight drool coming out of the dragon's mouth as she showed her handiwork to him. That's, nice, said Izuku as he quickly shut his notebook. Before either of them could say anything more, Kana had picked up something else and was holding it up for Izuku to identify. After breathing a sigh of relief, Izuku explained that it was a stapler. Like with the pen, Izuku showed both Kana and Toru how it worked before the young dragon went off to find something else. What's this? She asked, holding up a seal stamp. Oh, that's easy, said Toru before Izuku could say anything. Hands on her hips, she had the look of someone with smug superiority. It's a tool used in slave branding. You use it to mark your property. Izuku felt his jaw drop at just how wrong Toru was. He was about to shout that she was dead wrong, when all of a sudden Toru's eyes opened, giving her the appearance of someone who just had an amazing epiphany. She then squatted on the ground, opening up her blouse so that she exposed her bare back to Izuku. Toru then turned her head to look at him, hard in her eyes and drool escaping her lips again. "Mr. Midoriya, would you please brand me as yours?" At that, Izuku felt his soul leave his body. Yes, another flashback. "Oh, Mr. Midoriya," cried Toru as the bathroom door burst open, causing Izuku to let out a loud cry. The teen was seated on a stool, washing the sweat off his body before getting into the bath with his back facing the door. But as soon as he heard Toru, he instinctively turned around only for his face to turn a bright red. Standing there in the doorway was his maid wearing nothing at all. "Please allow your maid to wash you using her own body," she said with a giggle. "No," yelled Izuku. "I can do it myself." Back to present. "Honestly," said Izuku at last as he went to rest his chin on his hand. "Compared to what Toru says and does on a daily basis, Midnight feels a little tame." Though Izuku had only been speaking loud enough for only the people sitting next to him to hear anything, somehow the entire class heard him clear as day. Almost everyone in the class turned to stare at him with wide-eyed shock and, in some cases, envy. The only one who didn't was Tsu, who just brought a finger to her chin. "Come to think about it, you have a point." "Ribbit," said the frog girl with a knowing look. "No, there's someone out there that Minta got no further as a newer, more powerful nosebleed occurred. One that literally launched him away from his desk, spraying the surface with his blood as the bite-sized pervert flew upwards before landing on the ground. A moment later, 2 robots carried Minta away on a stretcher. From there, the day progressed normally with Minta returning from Recovery Girl's office right before lunch. By this point, Izuku was feeling over the moon with joy, as he had collected autographs from every single hero, while also asking a few questions about their quirks. Even the cooking hero lunch rush was no exception. Honestly, there was a part of him that wished he could preserve the first meal he had gotten at this school. However, all of that paled in comparison to the single class that would be taking up the remainder of their afternoon. The one that only people in the hero course would be taking. Heroics. So it was no surprise to see that everyone in 1A was looking excited. "I wonder who our teacher is going to be?" asked a very excited Izuku, doing his best not to destroy his desk again. While they were not programmed with a personality, somehow Izuku could tell that the robots here were getting really annoyed with him. "I bet it's All Might," exclaimed Kirishima, Izuku's red-haired classmate with sharp, jagged teeth. "I mean, who else are they going to get?" That caught Izuku's attention, causing him to whip his head around and stare at Kirishima. "Wait, All Might is teaching here?" As Kirishima looked at the dragon teen in confusion, Tsu turned to give Izuku a look. "Don't you remember Midoriya? He said it himself in my acceptance video." Ribbit. "Whoa, seriously? All Might was the one giving you your acceptance speech?" asked a shocked Kirishima. "You're lucky. I got Principal Nezu. But afterwards, he did tell me that All Might was joining that staff. Guess whoever did yours just failed to mention it." "Oh, I didn't get one," admitted Izuku sheepishly, suddenly finding the surface of his desk extremely interesting. Apparently, there was an issue when they went to record mine, so the principal had to come over himself. "I see," said Tsu, while Kirishima gave his dragon classmate a sympathetic look. "I was wondering why you weren't more excited when we had our graduation party. Figured it was either that the shock hadn't fully subsided, or you were trying not to make a scene." Kirishima gave his classmate a sympathetic look. But before he could say anything, Bakugo loudly set his feet on his desk, while leaning back in his seat. "They were probably lying to you," stated Bakugo, loud enough for the entire class to hear him. "Didn't want to waste a special holographic recorder on your shitty ass." Then, before anyone could respond to that, "I am here coming through the door like a normal person. declared All Might as the door was thrust open. The class gasped and cheered in delight as All Might strode into the room, taking large exaggerated steps toward the front of the room. And, for a moment, Izuku joined in, allowing his fanboy nature to shine brightly once again. That is until All Might began to scan the room, the hero's famous smile vanishing when he looked directly at the team. What replaced it was the sort of look a hero would give a villain, making the teen's blood run cold as his own cheerfulness vanished. Thankfully, All Might didn't dwell on Midoriya for long, as a moment later, he turned to look at the class as a whole, while flashing that brilliant smile of his that had almost been a source of comfort to the teen. But for Izuku Midoriya, that moment seemed to last forever. What's worse was that he wasn't the only one who noticed this frosty look. While All Might spoke about the battle trails, Aizawa's class kept shifting their gaze over to Midoriya. Then, when the hero finished speaking and left the class in a hurry, Tsu said what they were all thinking. "Is there a problem between you and All Might?" she asked, looking directly into her friend's eyes. "Ribbit. Because it looks like he really doesn't like you." "I'm, not sure," responded Izuku, unable to hide his crestfallen expression. With a sigh, Izuku then got out of his seat and headed towards the briefcase that held his costume. As he walked over to it, he noticed that most of his classmates were still giving him curious looks. While they hadn't known Izuku for very long, they could tell that he was both a very humble and honest person. It was also painfully clear to them just how much he looked up to and admired heroes. So they knew that having All Might, being the only person to give him a look like that, hurt him. The lone exception to this was Bakugo, who had a triumphant smirk on his face. "I bet he remembers me from that rooftop," thought Izuku as he grabbed his own case, swallowing down the worry that was forming in his gut. I mean, how could he forget the stupid kid who grabbed onto his leg and then found out his secret? He probably thinks that I lied to him about being quirkless, or that I could blab his secret at any moment. I need to apologize to him somehow and explain it in a way that doesn't expose Toru or Kana. Just need to figure out how." Once more, Izuku went into the changing room, where he shifted his appearance using magic. When he left, he wore a green skin-tight outfit with black lines running down the sides along with long white gloves. Though he did not head directly to the training area where the exercise would be held, as he didn't want to be alone with All Might right now. He needed some more time to figure out what he was going to say, as well as not wanting it to get interrupted. So there he stood in the hallway, waiting for the rest of the class to arrive before they all made their way down as a group. Now assembled at the entrance to the mock city, All Might went to work explaining the exercise in better detail before randomly selecting teams. It seemed that luck was on Midoriya's side, as he was not partnered with Bakugo, but instead Tsu. Yet that was where his luck ended, as not only was he going to be a part of the first hero team to do the exercise, but he was going up against Bakugo and Yoroka. If only that were the worst of it. After the villain team went inside, All Might handed the heroes their capture tape, as well as a blueprint of the building to Tsu, all while keeping his frosty gaze on Izuku, causing both teens to feel like at any moment one of those fists would collide with Izuku's skull. Then, "I will be watching you closely," said All Might, teeth gritted so that his voice came out as a growl. That was all he said before walking away, as though nothing had happened. "He really has it out for you, Ribbit," said Tsu once the man was out of earshot. She then turned to look at Izuku, her eyes filled with concern. "I think you should talk to Mr. Aizawa about this. Or maybe Principal Nezu." Hearing that caught Izuku off guard. A brief moment of panic appeared on his face. The teen knew that Tsu was just looking out for his well-being, and that she had a point. While he had only known Aizawa for a short amount of time, it was pretty obvious that he was a no-nonsense type of person who took heroing extremely seriously. Because of this, he would see All Might's attitude and behavior towards Izuku as a hindrance. The same would probably go for Nezu. So talking to them about this was probably the smartest thing he could do under normal circumstances. Only, these weren't normal circumstances. The problem was that both of them were really, really smart. If Izuku went to talk to them about this, there was no doubt in his mind that they would begin asking questions. If he wasn't careful and slipped up, he might reveal how the two of them first met. And if All Might was angry with him, now there was no telling how furious the man would be if they found out about his weakened state. That was supposed to be a super big secret after all. It's nothing, Tsu. I've dealt with worse, replied Izuku honestly. That doesn't mean you should. Ribbit, countered Tsu. I'll be fine, said Izuku as he tried his best to waive the concern. Besides, it's like what Mr. Aizawa said. It's a hero's job to face the unfairness of the world. I'll just work hard to show All Might the type of person I am. So let's start right now and figure out how we're going to win this. While Izuku said this with his brightest smile, he could see that Tsu remained unconvinced. Yet she didn't push it, instead moving closer to the dragon teen as they began to plan out their strategy. This should be really simple, said Tsu, glancing down at the floor plan and then up at the building. You could just turn into your dragon form and crash through a window to grab the bomb. As she spoke, Tsu brought a finger to her chin as she imagined how that would go. Her imagination was, for some reason, drawn in crayon. There, a cartoonish and more friendly version of Izuku's dragon form stood next to a poorly drawn version of the building. She then watched in her mind as the dragon reached into the building before plucking out the bomb. Maybe, but wouldn't that defeat the purpose of the test? Questioned Izuku. This is supposed to be a team indoor training exercise. I don't want you to be graded down because I did all the work. Plus, what if we get marked down if we cause structural damage to the building? At that, Tsu tilted her head. Do you really think he would do that? I mean, heroes damage property all the time, and they never seem to get into any trouble. Not all the time, said Izuku as he called up some of his memories of watching hero news. There have been times when a hero got penalized for excessive damages. When that happens, it's mostly because it was their first choice, and they ignored other options. Tsu let out a noise of agreement as she nodded. All right, then how about your fire attacks? She asked. Didn't you tell me that you were somehow training your fire breath to only target certain things? We could use it to knock out both villains without damaging the surrounding area. Then we could capture both them and the bomb at the same time. Ah, about that, began Izuku while scratching his cheek in mild embarrassment. I've been making progress with it, but only so much. Right now it's at incinerate everything within a certain space without damaging the walls level. Not even at the point where I am comfortable testing it on a living thing above a bug. And I really don't think Recovery Girl will be able to heal them from ashes. At that, Tsu paled. Good point, she agreed. So, do you have any ideas? Izuku hesitated for a moment before nodding. I've known Kaken for as long as I can remember. He's never been the type to sit and wait for something to come to him. Meaning as soon as the exercise starts, he'll come right at us. He's also not the type of person who likes to rely on others. So he'll most likely go off on his own, leaving Uraraka to either follow him or guard the bomb on her own. Since he knows I can fly, he's going to assume that I'll take us to the roof, meaning that's where he's likely to head to as soon as we start. So, rather than do what he wants, we go in through the front door. After a minute or two, he'll realize he was wrong and burn up more stamina heading for me. Oh, sorry. I guess I should say us. No worries, replied Tsu with a nod. He hasn't really hidden it all too well how he feels about you. If Aizawa hadn't stopped him yesterday, he would have attacked you for sure, Ribbit. But now he has full permission to fight, even using his quirk. I'm pretty certain that he'll be gunning for you specifically, Ribbit. Now it was Izuku's turn to nod. And that's what I plan on taking advantage of, he stated. Yesterday's tests with Aizawa showed me I still have a way to go with controlling my strength. One wrong move and I could potentially cripple or even kill Kaken. But I know I can take his blasts. So while Kaken focuses on me, I'd like for you to deal with Uraraka and the bomb. We know that she can remove the effects of gravity of anything she touches, but I feel confident that you can jump out of the way before she can get too close. And even if she does touch me, I can just stick to the ground, added Sue, understanding where her friend was going with all of this. Also, Uraraka only knows a little bit about my quirk. I never showed her what my tongue can do. So, if she tries to come at me after making herself weightless, I can just wrap my tongue around her before capturing her. This way, we're both contributing as a team, finished Izuku with a smile. X. Meanwhile, as the hero team was making up their plan, Uraraka could be found sitting on one of the large crates situated along the sides of the room. As her legs kicked back and forth, she shot a glance to her teammate who was just pacing across the room. The same thing he had done since they had gotten here. Neither had said a word to the other. No planning. No coming up with any ideas. Not even a "it's nice to work with you." The only noises that could be heard was when Uraraka's feet hit the wooden crate a little too hard and Bakugo occasionally grinding his teeth a little too hard. Finally, Uraraka couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to pass this test. She had to do well in this class if she wanted to fulfill her dream to better support her family. Meaning she had to take the plunge and talk. So, she began, her voice sounding as awkward as she felt. "Do you want to talk about how we're—" "You do whatever you want," snarled Bakugo, as he suddenly stopped in his pacing. Currently his back was towards her, hands clenched into fists that would have drawn blood had it not been for the special gloves he was wearing. "I'm going to beat that worthless Deku and the frog myself." "Deku?" echoed Uraraka, her face scrunching up a little as she thought about the word. "Isn't that what you called Midoriya yesterday?" Suddenly, her eyes brightened to the point where it was like sunshine was emanating from her body. "Is that like a childhood nickname? Like that word for you can do it? That's so sweet of you. You two must be friends too?" Uraraka was then silenced as Bakugo finally turned his head, so that he looked at her with one eye. Somehow, that red orb seemed all the more murderous. "That little shit is not my friend," he snarled. "He's worthless. More than that, he's been hiding that quirk from me for years. Pretending to be quirkless all while laughing about it behind my back. Then he goes and pretends to be sick, living alone in that apartment with that stupid, ugly cosplaying mate of his just so he can get us to drag our sorry asses to his place to deliver him his missing assignments. Bet he was laughing at us the moment the door closed. Then, he makes all the other losers worry about him by suddenly changing schools. Bet that's when he finally dropped the act, so he and Frog Bitch could have a good laugh. Ah, maybe it's just me, but I don't know what's so funny about that," said Uraraka. "Seems needlessly drawn out for some kind of joke. Are you sure you're not projecting your—" Before Uraraka could finish her sentence, All Might's voice came booming in to inform everyone that the test had started. Without missing a beat, Bakugo raced out of the room, screaming the entire way. As for Uraraka, she just sighed before giving the bomb a deadpan expression. "Guess it's just you and me, Balmy," she said. Then, a slight smile crept onto her face. "So, since it's just us girls, what do you think of calling Midoriya Deku from now on? It's kind of cute, don't you think?" The bomb remained silent, causing Uraraka to let out a huff. "Well, I think it's cute. But moving on, do you think there's something going on between Deku and Bakugo? Like they're—" "I am not a tsundere," screamed Bakugo as he ran past the door, heading back from the roof towards the ground floor at a frightening pace. "Eep!" cried Uraraka as she jumped to her feet before hiding behind the bomb. "Balmy, protect me." X. Izuku and Sue walked carefully side by side through the deserted hallways of the mock building. Both carefully listened for the sounds of footsteps running down the hallway, a slew of swearing or explosions as they went. They didn't need to wait too long as, by the time they had reached the second floor, Bakugo rounded a corner ready to heat things up. "Deku!" yelled Bakugo. pointing an open palm at the green-haired teen, while his eyes held a savage, bloodthirsty look. Die! As the blonde screamed. He unleashed a mighty explosion. X. Meanwhile, the rest of Class 1 watched the scene unfolding before them as the blast obscured the image of the hero team on the monitor. The sound of the blast dominating the room save only for the laughter coming from Bakugo. There was no way to tell what was happening, only allowing their imagination to paint the picture of what they were hearing. And what they were all fearing was not helped by the last image they had of the blonde bomber. In the limited time they had spent with Bakugo, it was pretty obvious to everyone there that he was intense, as well as having some sort of issue with Midoriya. Yet, that last look they had seen on his face right before the explosion made him appear almost unhinged. But what was even more unsettling was how All Might reacted. Or rather, didn't react. Since the man had entered the monitoring room, he had barely said a word to anyone. He watched Izuku as he spoke to Tsu like a hawk, paying no mind to what was happening on the other monitor with the villain team. And even now, he was keeping his focus on where Midoriya had been standing, while seeming to completely ignore what Bakugo had said and done. And that scared more than half the class. Yet after a moment, the dread that the observers were feeling vanished as the flames subsided. Standing there, having never moved an inch, was Midoriya. The teen's dragon wings had somehow grown, wrapping themselves around him and Tsu. With the wings unfurling slightly, the class could see that she was pressed against Izuku's body with one arm wrapped around her waist to pull her in as close as possible. Ashido would have been jumping up and down, calling it romantic, had it not been for the look of shock in the frog girl's eyes. Shock that slowly turned into relief as she said something to Midoriya before he let her go. "Did you see what Midoriya did there?" asked an excited Kirishima. Dude took a surprise blast and protected his partner with his body. "Damn, that's so manly." "Indeed," said their bird-headed classmate, Takoyami, with a nod. Then he glanced over at Bakugo. Meanwhile, Bakugo seems to be taking to his role as a villain well. A sneak attack like that along with no hesitation to do serious harm is what one would expect from one with a black soul. "Maybe taking to it a little too well," said Toru, her gloves and shoes shuddering. "That guy gives me the creeps." Ida, for his part, said nothing as he focused on the scene before them. He watched as an enraged Bakugo charged forward, while screaming something once more. Then, just as the flames and smoke were erupting from the blonde's palm, Midoriya took Tsu as they sidestepped the attack together, while his wings expanded once more. With them outstretched like this, they created a barrier that allowed Tsu to hop past Bakugo easily. Soon, it was just the two in the hallway, while a different monitor instantly lit up, following Tsu as she made her way through the building. The largest screen kept its focus on Midoriya and Bakugo. "X. Damn you," screamed Bakugo as he lunged forward, ready to deliver a powerful right hook. There was a look in the teen's eyes that Izuku could easily read, one that believed that the green-haired teen would never see it coming. That couldn't have been farther from the truth. He had known what was coming even without relying on his enhanced dragon features. So, as time seemed to stand still once more, Izuku sidestepped the attack just at the last possible second. Then, once time began to move normally again, he watched as Bakugo sailed past him harmlessly. At least, at first he did. The moment Bakugo realized that Izuku had managed to dodge the attack, he corrected himself by using a series of explosions to change course, while at the same time adding to the momentum. Now his attack was an arm swipe aimed directly for the head, only for Izuku to bend down so the attack sailed over him harmlessly. "Damn it!" screamed Bakugo as he landed, jumping back to get some distance. But only briefly, for as soon as his feet touched the ground, the teen brought his hands back. In the span of a breath, massive explosions sent the teen flying faster than ever towards his target. Bakugo then twisted his body, ready to punch Izuku right in the face with all the force and momentum he had. "Stop looking down at me, you piece of shit." Izuku's response to this was to catch the attack with a raised palm. Bakugo could only stare with wide eyes as his body came to a complete halt, the wind from his charge whipping past the dragon teen who remained unmoving. Then, before Bakugo could fall to the ground, Izuku applied the smallest bit of pressure to his palm as he pushed forward. The next thing they knew, Bakugo was sent flying backwards down the hallway, while screaming the word "fuck" the entire way until it was ended with a crash. "Kaken," cried Izuku. "Are you okay? I didn't hurt you, did I?" For several tense seconds, the silence that followed ate away at the teen's nerves, fearful that he had injured a long-time friend. But before he could say anything else, an explosion erupted from the dark hallway. "Stop looking down on me," screamed Bakugo as she rocketed towards Izuku. Though the blonde's anger only grew when Izuku, rather than becoming timid or looking horrified that Bakugo was back on his feet, let out a sigh as relief washed over his face. "Oh good," said Izuku in a genuine tone. "You're okay." This comment only caused Bakugo to scream all the louder. As the time ticked away, the students in the monitoring room constantly shifted their attention from the fight between the boys and the girls, as Izuku simply dodged everything that was thrown at him by Bakugo while running away, forcing his attacker to give chase. Tsu had found the bomb room. It hadn't been hard to figure that out, as Uraraka, once she had moved out from behind the bomb, had begun to create a wall at the door. Using her quirk, she had removed the effects of gravity from all the crates before moving them in front of the door. So, when Tsu opened the door that led to the bomb, she was met with a decent obstacle. The class watched as Tsu hesitated for only a moment before acting, searching for another way inside. This came in the form of an air vent which took her right into the room. Thankfully, Uraraka had decided to stay close to the bomb. So when she saw Tsu landing in the room, Uraraka used her quirk to pick up the thankfully fake explosive device as she began to play a game of keep away with it. Meanwhile, back with the other explosive device, Bakugo looked like he was getting frustrated. Midoriya was using his wings more now to fly backwards and gain more distance between him and his target. That, or he would create a powerful gust of wind that would send Bakugo flying backwards, saved from falling down on his ass by his use of explosions to right himself at the last moment. Still, Midoriya was avoiding throwing any punches of his own. Given what a seemingly light push had done, nearly all of the class could understand why. Only one didn't see it that way. "Stop looking down at me," yelled Bakugo as Izuku continued to dodge his attacks. "Do you think I'm so weak that I can't take a little punch?" "Ah, it's not about you being weak," said Izuku as he used one of his wings to block another explosion. "I mean, I know just how strong your quirk is. It's just that I don't think you're strong enough to not be instantly liquidated if I use too much force. I could never forgive myself if you suddenly became goop splattered on the wall." Izuku had said all this with pure concern and honesty in his voice, without a hint of pride to make it sound even somewhat condescending. But despite this, that's exactly how it sounded to Bakugo as new veins seemed to appear in his eyes. "Deku," he growled. "Bet you think you were really funny, don't you? Hiding that quirk from me all these years. Pretending to be sick." "I really was sick," shouted Izuku. "I don't believe you," shouted Bakugo. Then the ashen blonde teen noticed his grenade-shaped gauntlet light up, causing him to grin. Slowly, he raised one arm up to the dragon teen, while the opposite hand reached for the pin. "Since you're such a quirk nerd, you know how mine works. I sweat nitroglycerin from my palms, which I can then ignite. The more I sweat, the more powerful the explosion. Which is why I asked for these babies. See, they're not decorative. Since the start of the fight, they've both been collecting sweat and storing them up for the biggest explosion of all time. And guess who gets to be their first victim? Surely Bakugo is not so careless to unleash such a blast?" asked Ida loudly, though his voice sounded unsure of his statement as he looked at the murderous smile on Bakugo's face. And he wasn't the only one who had his doubts. It, it sure looks like it, whispered Ishido. Midoriya better dodge unless he wants to be cremated, commented Todoroki, doing his best to hide the flinches of phantom pain he was experiencing as he had been on the receiving end of high-powered flames many times at his home. All might, sir, said Ida as he walked over to the massive hero, unable to take the danger they were all witnessing any longer. With all due respect, this exercise is getting a little out of hand. All Might? By this point, Ida had gotten to All Might's side, so that he could now see the pro-hero's face clearly. And what he saw frightened him. All Might's attention was hyper-focused on Midoriya and Midoriya alone. He hadn't noticed anything that Bakugo had done, nor did he seem to register the danger that Midoriya was in at the moment. He just kept staring at Midoriya with narrowed eyes and a scowl. With a new wave of panic, Ida reached over to grab the pro-hero by the arm. The sudden touch seemed to snap All Might back to reality as he jumped in surprise before looking over at Ida in confusion. Young Ida, what? Began the pro-hero, but was further surprised when Ida interrupted him. You have to stop this, shouted the speedster while pointing to the screen. If that explosion hits Midoriya, he could die. That caused All Might's eyes to widen as he turned to look at what his student was pointing at, taking a step back as if noticing the seriousness of the situation for the first time. But before he could tell Bakugo to stand down, a massive explosion, unlike anything any of them had seen before, was unleashed. A blast so powerful that it rocked the building as well as the monitoring room they were in. And, for a moment, everyone there thought that Izuku Midoriya was dead. That was until the smoke cleared, revealing Izuku's dragon wings, which had extended themselves outward to create a barrier. Wisps of smoke rose from parts of the unblemished wings, showing that no harm had come to them. And when they retracted back to their normal size, Izuku looked perfectly fine as well. As all signs of victory left Bakugo's face, a buzzer sounded signaling that Tsu had captured the bomb using her tongue. After calling all the young heroes back to the monitoring room over the paw, All Might placed a hand over his face as sweat began to cover it. Now he could feel the quickened pace of his heart, while a rush of adrenaline began to course through him. Too late to do anything about the situation, only making the realization of what had just happened on his watch all the more horrific. I could have gotten one of my students killed, he thought. No, I could have gotten all of them killed. All it would have taken was enough damage to the support, and the entire building could have collapsed. What's wrong with me? It was early the next day, Toru humming a tune as she washed the dishes in the mostly empty apartment. Mr. Midoriya had already left some time ago in order to make it to that pathetic excuse of a human school with a bit of a spring in his step. It seemed that the excitement from being taught by what this world considered the best heroes had not died down. Meanwhile, Kana was still getting ready to go out. However, unlike most weekdays, she lacked her red backpack, which reminded the dragons of blood. Due to an accidental quirk used by one of the students, the school was closed as repairs and decontamination were needed. Whatever that meant. Honestly, the foolishness of humans never ceased to amaze Toru. If they just got off their lazy behinds and learned magic, then they could have fixed the problem in an instant. Well, at least Kana wasn't going to waste today, as she was going to do a little exploring in this world. Okay, I'm heading out, announced Kana now that she was ready. Toru looked up from her work to give the girl a once-over. She was dressed in her normal attire, but there were a few carry-on items. The first was a small pouch tied to the dragon girl's wrist, which held a small wallet with some money, should she need it, as well as a smartphone. Mr. Midoriya had been very kind to get them these phones as his family plan had a few extra lines available. On the phone was the apartment's landline number, Toru's number, and his number in case she ever needed emergency help. While Toru insisted that a powerful dragon such as themselves had very little to fear in this world, Mr. Midoriya seemed rather insistent. There was also a GPS app on it that would help Kana should she ever get lost. Have fun exploring the city, Kana, said the dragon maid once she saw that the younger girl was ready to head out. After quickly drying her hands, Toru followed Kana to the front door. And remember what I told you about crossing the street? The young dragon girl nodded as she looked up at Toru. Always look both ways for cars before crossing. If I don't and I get hit by one, I might end up smashing it, she said simply. Toru smiled approvingly as she waved her young friend off, knowing that as soon as the door closed, Kana would use the perception blocking spell that she had recently learned before taking to the skies in her true form. Indeed, a few moments later, the dragon maid could hear the giant wing beats as well as feeling a sudden increase in wind speed. Now alone within the apartment, Toru's smile turned from kind to something completely feral, revealing her draconic fangs as she raised her hands, while cracking every finger just by clenching them. Her eyes even seemed to glow red as she shot a glance at the kitchen, pot, and pans at the ready, while a wide spread of ingredients lay spread. It was now time to take on the poor, pitiful fool who thought he could challenge her and prove her superiority. As the dragon maid went to work cooking, she thought about how this had begun when Mr. Midoriya had told them about his first real day at UA. Toru had sat there sipping tea, pleased that her master was enjoying himself at his dream school and listening to him going on about all the amazing pros that worked there. Mr. Midoriya even went on to talk about their meager accomplishments as if they were really anything to brag about. Like this power loader person who was teaching them science and had built his own exoskeleton suit. Big deal. She had known plenty of knights who bragged about crafting their own enchanted armor before eating them. Or how someone named Ectoplasm was teaching them math, and how he once dealt with several emergencies at the same time by making clones. Like that was something to be proud of. With her speed, she could do the same thing without needing to make lousy copies of herself. At first, she thought her biggest issue would have been this midnight person who seemed to flirt with her students and taught modern art. But after listening to Mr. Midoriya, she realized she had nothing to worry about. After all, why go after a granny when he had the sexiest dragon maid in the entire world waiting for him at home? A sexy dragon maid who would do anything for him and only him, while this midnight person had to be shared with everyone. Also, she could tell that this woman wasn't Mr. Midoriya's type. Still, like any reasonable dragon, you can never be too careful when protecting your treasure. If Granny Midnight tried going after her master in earnest, then she would need to remind Mr. Midoriya what a real dragon had to offer. However, it was after that that Toru learned about the one who was her biggest threat to keeping Mr. Midoriya all to herself. The single most dangerous hero in the world, making him her mortal enemy for all eternity. And get this, Mr. Midoriya had said. Lunch Rush cooks our lunches. He's so amazingly talented. His cooking is almost as good as yours. Almost. That word seemed to echo through Toru's head as she sat there, eye twitching. That word implied that this mere human thought that he could compete with her when there should be no contest. She had to do something. Well, other than flying out into the night sky, hunting this hero down, and destroying him for his crime. She was sure that, if she did that, Izuku would scold her and be mad at her for a while. Plus, she might get caught. While she wasn't afraid of the heroes, having them constantly coming after her and her wiping them from existence would just be too much of a hassle. Plus, it would get in the way of her time with Mr. Midoriya. So, she needed to prove that there was no one around who could do anything better than a dragon like herself. With that in mind, she went to work putting her all in the creation of a marvelous lunch. Soon delicious scents filled the apartment, so strong that any passerby's mouth would begin to water. It took her a while, but when the dragon maid of destruction was finished with her cooking, she lovely packaged her creations before placing them into a basket. Once everything was packed, Toru headed out to UA, with a smile on her face. While Toru made her way towards the train station, Kana found herself walking down the sidewalk of one of the many cities of Japan. Which city it was, well, she had no idea other than she had never been here before. But the fact that it was a city, and a crowded one at that, meant that there were bound to be many things that the young dragon girl had never seen before. Meaning it was a good place to go exploring in her human form. The young dragon's eyes sparkled at every new discovery she spotted, whether it was some weird human thing, or just someone who looked unusual due to their quirk. However, while this was very exciting, it was just a bit lonely as she had no one to talk to. Izuku still had to go to his school and couldn't just take a day off to spend time with her. As for her best friend, Satsuki, wasn't allowed to leave her apartment. Lady Toru was busy with something else, though Kana suspected that she wouldn't have been the best guide. Izuku and Satsuki knew much more about this world. Hopefully, she could find someone who wanted to talk and play with her. But in the meantime, she could take a whole bunch of pictures of all the weird things she didn't know so she could ask Izuku about it when he came home. This wish was granted several minutes later, as Kana's ears picked up odd sounds. 2 pairs of footsteps, one of someone bigger than most, and the other much smaller wearing no shoes. This piqued the young dragon's curiosity, wondering if people were playing some sort of game. Taking off at what humans would consider a light sprint, Kana headed towards an alleyway just up ahead where the sounds were coming from. She had timed it so that, when she arrived at her destination, someone would be making their way onto the main street. The first human that Kana saw was a young girl with white hair and a single horn coming out of her head. Her red eyes looked scared as she raced towards Kana, wearing that thing she saw humans wearing in hospital shows. Izuku called it a medical gown. Behind her was a much larger man, wearing a mask she saw people wearing back in her world. The weird ones that reminded her of a bird's face. As for the rest of him, nothing really stood out. Just a plain old white shirt, dark pants, 2 belts for some reason, and gloves that looked like they were made out of some sort of wrapping. By this point, the man was almost on top of the horned girl. Reaching out with one of his large hands, he went to grab the little girl by the back of her hospital gown and pull her back into the darkness of the alleyway. But before his fingers ever made contact with the material, Kana moved so she was instantly between them. Upon seeing a new little girl appearing right in front of him, the large man pulled his hand back in surprise while coming to a halt. As for the horned girl, she nearly tripped over her own feet. Yet the other girl managed to right herself as she continued to run with tears in her eyes. In the blink of an eye, Kana was running right next to the new white-haired girl. "What's going on?" she asked. The look of fear seemed to grow more in those red eyes, only to flinch when the man spoke. However, the girl wasn't the one to speak up. Instead, it was the larger man as he strode towards them. "This is such a headache. Come on, Eri. The boss is going to be really mad if he finds out you escaped again," said the man. Now Kana could see the look of fear growing all the more intense in those red eyes, tears threatening to spill out at any moment while she bit her lower lip. And while this was going on, the man continued to talk. "So be a good girl, and if you come back quietly, I might not need to tell him that you were out. It'll be our little secret. No one will have to get hurt. And no, I don't want to get hurt again," whispered the girl now known as Aries, more to herself than to anyone else. At the same time, Kana believed she understood enough of what was going on. So she stopped running, turning around to face the man who was taller than Izuku, while planting her feet on the ground. In return, the man rolled his eyes behind his mask before swiping at the girl to knock her out of the way. Or, at least, he tried to. But the girl remained where she was as if she were rooted to the ground. What's more, her expression showed that she didn't even feel, or perhaps even register what he had done. Figuring that this had to be her quirk in action, Rappa decided on a less than gentle approach. If he couldn't knock her to the side, then he would have to knock her out. So, after pulling his fist back, he fired a punch while making sure he only used half the strength he normally used when beating the ever-living shit out of someone. Yet the blow never made contact as the girl just held up a single, tiny finger to block the blow. What was even more amazing was that it worked. Air was displaced as his fist came to a complete stop, while feeling like he had just punched a triple reinforced safe. For a moment, the criminal known as Rappa stood there looking down at the girl with a slightly dumbfounded expression on his face. But halfway through trying to figure out this was possible, he simply gave up as a wide grin appeared underneath his mask. Forget how it was possible. There was someone who could stop one of his punches. A weak one, but she did stop it. Now, the question was this: could she stop multiple ones going full force? Well, there was only one way to find out. "Let's see what you got, kid," yelled Rappa as he pulled his fist back, preparing to punch straight at the girl with all his might. He didn't care if he seriously hurt her because, if he did, then the boss could patch her right up in order to prevent people from growing suspicious. The blow struck with enough force that the aftershocks knocked down a still fleeing Eri. Several trash cans and their contents were sent flying up into the air. People around them seemed to finally notice what was going on, screaming in fear as they ran away. Either to call a hero or just get out of the way in case they too might get dragged into whatever this was. But despite all of that, the little two-horned girl just blocked the blow like it was nothing. Rappa then launched a punch with his other fist only for the girl to use the same finger to stop it. Laughing with glee, Rappa began to rain down blows upon this seemingly ordinary girl. The force behind the blows got stronger and stronger, while their speed increased until they were nothing but a blur. Yet, despite all this, the girl just blocked every single one of them as the wind whipped about. Always with the same little finger, while utterly unfazed by it all. After a solid minute of this, the girl vanished from the path of his fist and then reappeared closer to him. Rappa only had a moment to register what was happening before she poked him in the stomach with a single finger. To his surprise, it felt more like he had been punched in the gut by someone with a strength-enhancing quirk. Doubling over, Rappa fell to his knees while clutching his stomach before then falling to the side. As the man began making sounds like his breakfast would be exiting his stomach at any moment, Kana turned to the girl she had saved. Eri, still lying there on the sidewalk, trembled in fear at what would befall her now. Less about the person and more to do with the power they had shown as well as what overhaul would do to her. While Eri was aware she didn't know much about the world outside of the compound, she knew that what just happened wasn't natural. She knew that Rappa was one of the elites who served under overhaul, and that all of the others who watched her whispered how terrifying he was. That even if they all ganged up on someone like him, they wouldn't stand a chance. So to find someone who could stand up to a person like that was incredible. Yet, in the end, it wouldn't matter. Eri knew just how dangerous Overhaul really was. With just a single touch, he could bring down even the strongest that served him. And he would do to this girl the same thing he had done to her so many times, cutting her over and over again, taking out pieces of her body until she could no longer continue living before exploding and reforming all in an instant. A constant cycle where she was tortured, killed, and then brought back to life only to repeat it all over again. Then there was her own curse. She didn't want anything bad to happen to this girl. She had to tell her to. "Let's go play," said the girl as she reached out a hand. Eri, dumbfounded, just stared at the hand as she tried her best to register this alien request. She had heard something similar from the people who worked for Overhaul whenever they brought her something. They always said it was something for you to play with. But she didn't know what play was, and none of the men ever stayed long enough to show her. "Come on, let's go play," repeated the dual-horned girl as she then grabbed Eri's hand. The next thing Eri knew was that she was being pulled down the street, away from that dark alleyway and into the light. Later, over at UA, Izuku Midoriya set down his lunch tray before slumping down into his seat. The green-haired teen's eyes were wide with veins visible due to the unusual amount of stress he was feeling at the moment. It all began when he had arrived at school this morning, having to make it past a slew of reporters gathered at the front of the school. Apparently, the press had finally heard that All Might had become a teacher at the school. So, naturally, They had a lot of questions for the man as well as the students. He, along with every other student, had been bombarded with questions on what it was like to be taught by All Might as well as asking him how the symbol of peace was adjusting to his life as a teacher. Something the dragon teen really didn't want to answer given their complicated history. If he said the wrong thing, he knew in his heart that it would only make the clear tension between the two worse. Thankfully, he had been able to get past them while keeping his mouth shut before Aizawa appeared on the scene to tell the reporters to leave. Unfortunately, the press had delayed the dragon teen. Not so that he would have been late for class, but for something that he knew he shouldn't put off for too long. That thing being talking with All Might. Izuku had planned on getting to school early so that he could go to the teacher's lounge and ask to speak with the symbol of peace in private, hoping to finally clear the air with him. Yet today, of all days, the train was running late. Not because of a villain, but thanks to Lukoa of all dragons. Apparently, she had decided to dress less casually than what she had worn when she had visited his house. Something about wanting to ride the train to the beach so she could go for a swim. Long story short, the police arrived and led Lukoa away while draping her with a towel. So that had delayed the young Midoriya, seriously tempting him to just fly to school. When you add that delay along with the press, it didn't leave much time for a meaningful talk between him and All Might. Izuku had hoped that maybe he could pull All Might over to the side during their lesson today. Yet that plan was dashed pretty quickly, as the pro hero would be working with 1B today instead. What's more, he found out that they would be discussing how their battle trails went as well as voting on class reps. For some strange reason, he had been elected to be their class's representative with Yaoyorozu receiving the vice rep role. It was honestly something he never expected to happen to him, even after leaving his old middle school. Then there was Toru. He didn't know what was going on, but she had been acting funny since last night, and he could tell she was planning on doing something. What it was, he had no idea. He just had to be on his guard in case something crazy or unexpected happened. "Relax, Midoriya," came Tsu's voice, snapping Izuku out of his thoughts so quickly that he nearly jumped out of his seat. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart, while breathing heavily before turning to look over at his froggy friend. Like him, Tsu had her lunch right in front of her, and was already digging into it. "You'll do fine, Ribbit. Besides, you wanted the job too. I saw you raise your hand when the position was brought up. Ribbit." For a moment, Izuku just sat there feeling slightly confused as he watched his friend munching on her food. Slowly, Izuku began to relax as a thoughtful smile appeared on his face. Tsu was normally really good at reading people. No doubt she had seen the state he was in and guessed what was bothering him. Well, she was right, as that was one of the things that was freaking him out right now. Not to mention that she was also right about wanting the position, as it looked good on resumes. Plus, many of the top heroes in Japan had been class reps as well. There was a lot this job could teach him to prepare for the day when he would run his own hero agency. "Guess I'm more surprised that I got the job," admitted Izuku after a moment. "It's a first for me." "Understandable," replied Tsu, nodding after swallowing a mouthful of food before speaking. "Just remember, if you feel in over your head, you can always count on your friends for advice." To that, Izuku smiled brightly. "I'll keep that in mind," said Izuku, smiling brightly as he did. He was about to take her up on the offer, bringing up the strange behavior with Toru so he could at least cross that off his list of issues, until he noticed something was missing from their table. "But, speaking of friends, have you seen Uraraka? I thought she was going to be having lunch with us." Now it was Tsu's turn to look thoughtful as she raised her head to look at the ceiling, tapping her chopsticks at the corner of her mouth. "She told me she needed to talk to Mr. Aizawa alone about something private, and that she would be with us as soon as she could," said the frog girl as she looked back at the dragon boy. "Hopefully Mr. Aizawa isn't too mad at her for keeping him up during his break. Though come to think of it, Ida isn't here either." "Oh, I spoke to him when we were leaving the classroom," said Izuku. He apologized, saying that he had scheduled a meeting with Principal Nezu. "I wonder what it's about." A shrug was the only answer he got, causing the dragon teen to let out a sigh. Rather than continuing to ponder what it was that his two friends were up to while devolving into a muttering spree, Izuku opted to instead start eating his lunch in peace. At the same time, Kana and Eri found themselves sitting on a park bench with what would be their lunch for the day. Originally, when Kana had started out on her little journey, she had wanted to stop at a ramen shop or get some okonomiyaki. That was something that was no longer possible with her newest friend, as she quickly found out. No matter what restaurant or store that they visited, both were turned away as the staff there informed them of the establishment's no shirts, no shoes, no service policy. And since Eri wasn't wearing any shoes, they were regretfully turned away. Luck, however, had not abandoned them. After being turned away for the fourth time, the two spotted an elderly man selling large bags of apples in the park. What's more, the kind man even gave them a couple of additional apples on the house. So now, the two were happily munching on their fruits, seemingly oblivious to the man watching them from behind a tree. Said man was wearing a burlap sack over his head, with two large holes cut out so he could see as well as a stitched-on smile. This man was known as Sorimitsu Tabe. "So hungry," whispered Tabe, drool escaping from his mask. As he began to pant, a few people who had just been walking away suddenly became creeped out by his actions and quickly made their exit while trying not to draw his attention. Not like they could, for at this moment Tabe was hyper-focused on his mission. Get Eri back and eat whoever stood in his way. Unable to control himself as the hunger continued to grow, Tabe bit into the tree he was still hiding behind. His teeth sank through it as if the wood was as soft as pudding, swallowing it to allow his stomach to disgust it with ease, just like everything else he ate. Yet still, nothing could satisfy his hunger for long. Right now, he could see his target as well as a tiny obstacle. He could do this. He would bring the girl back to repay the boss for everything he had done for him, and would let nothing stand in his way. "So hungry," screamed Tabe as he rushed from his hiding space, waving his hands in the air like one of those inflatable things you find at used car stores. "Hungry, hungry, hungry." The man ran towards Eri, waving his hands wildly in the air like a crazy person, all while never letting his sigh off the girl who Overhaul wanted. He could see Eri looking back at him with fear in her eyes, looking ready to bolt. But the other girl just looked at him in what seemed like confusion as he continued to scream. Fine. If she wasn't going to run, then he would just eat her. He didn't care. This was all for the boss. This was for. Tabe was suddenly stopped right in front of the little girl with Eri, as she had just shoved an apple into his mouth. The man blinked, chewing on the apple and feeling its juices splash around his mouth. He could feel his teeth connecting with the girl's arm, but for some reason, he couldn't bite through it. Yet, that didn't seem to bother him as the apple just tasted so good at that moment. Eventually, the girl pulled her arm out of his mouth before standing up on the bench to pat him on the head. "Does that feel better?" she asked. Tabe blinked before slowly nodding his head. "Would you like another?" she continued. Again, Tabe nodded. The two-horned girl nodded before gesturing to Tabe to sit next to her. Slowly, awkwardly, the man sat next to the girl who plopped back down to where she was sitting before then grabbing another apple. Once it was presented to him, he thanked her before taking it. Together, all three of them began to eat their apples in peace. And it was filling. While this strange scene was going on, Shigaraki stood within the mass of reporters, all trying to claw their way past the UA security gate. Unlike the rest of the reporters, he stood there wearing a hoodie that kept his facial features hidden along with jeans to make him look as unassuming as possible. The perfect look to begin the destruction of Hero Society, as they would never see it coming. Oh, this was the limited event he had been waiting for when he heard that All Might was teaching here. All he had to do to trigger it was to destroy the gate with his quirk to allow the reports in, and then he could. Excuse me. This caught the attention of the gamer villain. Turning his gaze to the side, his face hidden underneath his hoodie, he saw a cosplay maid with a picnic basket carried under one of her arms. Shigaraki blinked at this for a moment before quickly using the side of his hand to rub whatever had to be in his eyes to see something. Only the maid was still there. Now that he was looking at her fully, he could see that she had these small bat-like wings coming out of her back, as well as a large green tail that dragged on the ground behind her. A part of him knew that her appearance had to be because of her quirk. After all, what else could it be? Yet something felt a little off about her. Despite her cheerful expression, she emanated that same aura of death that radiated off of All for One. Now at the gate, she knocked on it several times. "Hello? I'm here to make a delivery," said the maid in a cheerful tone. However, nothing happened just as Shigaraki expected. Yet the cosplay maid just waited for a moment with that smile on her face until she tried again with a bit more urgency. Again, nothing happened. She knocked on the gates a few more times, her smile faltering as she repeated herself. With each knock, that aura around her grew stronger until it could almost be visibly seen by not only the villain, but the reporters around her. "Pitiful, puny humans, you dare ignore me!" She bellowed in rage, ceasing her knocking as she pulled back a leg to kick the door. While all the other NPCs took a step back, Shigaraki just stood as he knew she would only live to instantly regret this. After all, this was the famous UA gate and was supposed to be top of the line in defense. Rumor had it that All Might had tested it himself 6 or 7 years ago, punching it with all his might, resulting in only leaving behind a fist imprint that they later fixed. What's more, other top heroes over the years had been approached to use their quirks on it to see how well it could stand up to their quirks. People like Endeavor, who went scorched earth on it, couldn't melt it. The only thing that could destroy it would be something like his decay quirk. So, naturally, Shigaraki expected to see her either hopping on one foot, as she held her broken one with both hands, or just making a scuff mark on the gate. What he got instead was seeing the doors to the school go flying forwards at high speeds, crashing into the school, and becoming embedded into the walls directly on either side of the main building's entrance. He, as well as all of the reporters, felt their jaws drop at what they had just witnessed before they were further stunned by the maid rushing into the building while giggling. As the alarms began to blare, Shigaraki said the one thing that everyone was thinking. What the heck was that? X. Inside the school, the lunchroom was in a panic as the alarm sounded. Older students dashed towards the doors leading out, not bothering to give the younger or confused students an answer to what was going on. Yet this level of fear seemed to be infectious as more of the illustrious students of UA devolved into a panicked mob. As for Izuku, he stood with Tsu as the pair tried their best to call out to everyone asking what the alarm meant. These calls, however, were ignored in favor of crowding around the door, as they all tried to push their way through all at once. Perhaps this was something they were supposed to learn at orientation. Then, Izuku heard a familiar voice that seemed to cut through all the shouting of UA students as well as the blaring alarms. A voice that made his eyes go wide. And it was getting closer. Quickly turning towards the mass of students and the door, Izuku opened his mouth ready to shout at them. But before a sound could escape from him, the doors burst open with enough force that the assembled mass was flung back as something entered the room so quickly that it couldn't be seen by the naked eye. Only a dust cloud shooting forward, heading toward Midoriya before stopping right in front of him, causing the debris to wash over both him and Tsu, obscuring them from view. Then, when the cloud faded away, Toru seemed to just appear in front of Izuku, with a carefree smile on her face. "Good afternoon, Mr. Midoriya," she said cheerfully while holding up a picnic basket. "Toru here, ready to serve you a delicious, homemade lunch made by your ever-faithful dragon maid." Without waiting for a reply, Toru looked down at the meal Izuku had been eating before making a face like it repulsed her. With a quick motion, she slapped away the already paid-for meal with the side of her wrist, causing it to sail across the room. Wincing at the sound of the tray coming to a clatter and hitting someone in the process, the green-haired teen took in the sight of the lunchroom and the people who were still there. Most of them lay on the ground, their bodies covered in food as they landed either in large piles or in awkward positions. Some of them had landed on tables, breaking them in the process. Nearly all of them seemed to have passed out, but he did notice a few of them were still twitching as the alarm continued to blare above them. "Toru," he began, turning to the maid who was setting what looked like a 5-course lunch at his seat. "Could you, hold on for a moment?" "Holding," replied Toru in an almost sing-song tone, the dragon maid turning to look at him with a smile on her face. "How did you get in here?" asked Izuku. "Oh, that's easy, silly. I walked in through the gate like your average inferior human," she said before her smile began to fade as annoyance took over her features. "Though I have to say that this place is rude. I knocked on the door, but they refused to even talk to me. And since I didn't want the food I made for you with all the love and care I could give to get cold, I had to force myself inside. Then, when I got inside, I realized just how big this place was. Plus, the people in charge of this place were so rude. Instead of giving me directions, they told me to remain where I was." "Toru, did you use the visitor's entrance?" "The what?" asked Toru as her eyes went wide and white, her head tilting to the side as she looked at the Midoriya. That answer made Izuku want to cry, ready to say goodbye to his dream school. Not only would he be expelled for this, but knowing Toru, she would most likely destroy it in retribution. How could things get any worse? "You damned shitty maid." "Oh yeah, that's how." Slowly turning, Izuku saw Bakugo approaching them with the remains of Izuku's lunch in both his hair as well as running down his face. His eyes seemed to be alight with rage, veins pulsing around his temple. Saying the wrong thing would certainly cause him to explode. "Oh, if it isn't that tsundere," commented Toru as she gave Izuku's classmate an unimpressed look. "How did she ever learn that term?" screamed Izuku internally as he felt his soul leaving his body. "What the hell did you call me?" demanded Bakugo, his anger increasing, no doubt due to the comment, as he stomped over to the dragon maid. Yet despite being so angry that spit was flying from his mouth while screaming, Toru just continued to regard him with an unimpressed stare. "Geez, you're more annoying than those small bugs that get wedged in my teeth," complained the maid. With that, Toru went back to setting out Izuku's lunch, as if she had never been interrupted by the blonde. By this point, many of the students were slowly picking themselves up, a few glancing over at the strange new woman in the room, wondering where she came from, while a few of them wondered why a maid was suddenly in the lunchroom. The sound of the alarm still sounding returned their attention to their previous panic. Quickly, many students began making their way towards the door, while Toru just continued to set up Izuku's second lunch for the day, while Bakugo just kept screaming at her. Meanwhile, Izuku sat there with a dead look in his eyes, wondering how he was going to explain all of this to the teachers. "I'm sure it's not as bad as it seems," said Tsu as she sat next to Izuku, patting him on the back. "Just as long as nothing happens to make the situation worse, Ribbit, you should be." "All right, the school has gotten us maids," cried a familiar voice, one that caused Tsu to rest her face in her hands as she realized that it was about to get so much worse. There, crawling on the floor like a demented, perverted, lumpy purple spider was Minta. There was an obvious look of lust in his eyes as his focus seemed to be laser-focused on Toru. More specifically, the bottom of Toru's skirt. As Minta continued to crawl towards his target, drooling the entire way, Toru turned to glance at him. Well, less of a glance and more of an "I will destroy you so thoroughly that not even ashes will remain" type glare. To make it even more potent, Izuku saw her slit eyes becoming smaller, while more of her dragon traits could be seen on her face. Yet, despite this, Minta continued towards his and the world's doom. "Midoriya, you have a maid too?" cried Yaoyorozu, as she seemed to forget everything around her as she made her way over to Izuku's table. There was a look of genuine joy in her eyes, making them sparkle that didn't seem to fade, even when she stepped on Minta's head. Whether she knew or not that this action, which knocked Minta out cold, had saved the world, no one knew. "Excuse me," began Toru, looking irritated that another girl had approached the table. Though, thankfully, she was clearly far less angry. "I am trying to serve Mr. Midoriya a proper lunch to make sure that he has the energy he needs in order to be at his best." "Oh please," barked Bakugo. "Even moldy bread is too good for Deku." This brought back some of Toru's anger as she glared at Bakugo, her eyes now seeming to glow red. "I can see that," said Yaoyorozu happily, seeming to ignore the ashen blonde statement. She then took hold of Toru's hands, confusing the dragon maid. "Midoriya is fortunate to have such a wonderful and dedicated maid such as yourself looking after him." "Hey, began Bakugo, only to get knocked across the lunchroom by Toru's tail as the maid stared at Yaoyorozu gleefully. "Really?" asked the dragon maid, bouncing where she stood with sparkles in her eyes. "Absolutely," agreed Momo with a nod. "Not only have you brought him an exquisite meal, but did so at your own peril. Why, not even the maids of the Yaoyorozu estate would be so dedicated to make their way into a building with an alarm sounding." She then turned to Izuku. "I wish you had told me you had a maid. At long last I feel like I am connecting with my classmates as we now have something in common." As Toru began giggling with happiness at Yaoyorozu's comment, the doors to the cafeteria opened once more. Turning his head, Izuku spotted Ida with Nezu sitting on the teen's shoulder drinking his tea. Behind him were several of the other teachers, including Aizawa, Vlad King, Midnight, Present Mike, and Power Loader. "Ah, Miss Toru," said Nezu in a cheerful tone as the alarms finally turned off. "How wonderful to see you again. If you don't mind, would you kindly follow me to my office so that we may speak on your conduct? Starting with as to why you broke in, damaged the front gate, and then ran away from the heroes. X." Later, when school finally ended, Izuku walked back to the train station with Toru by his side. Said maid was smiling triumphantly, swinging her arms back and forth as she walked beside him. Though it would be hard to blame her given how light her punishment was. He was sure that when Nezu said that they would let this slide, asking her to pay for repairs for the gate, as well as cleaning the mess in the cafeteria, that he had expected it to be more challenging. Nor did he expect a counteroffer from Toru, saying she would simply fix it as good as new, doing so with her magic in just a few seconds. As for himself, he wasn't in any trouble. They just had to make sure that this never happened again. Ever. Once they got on the train, Izuku pulled out his phone to relax with a little hero news. However, what he saw when he opened the app made his eyes bulge. "Is something wrong, Mr. Midoriya?" asked Toru, who was sitting next to him. Silently, Izuku showed Toru, who after a few minutes of reading gasped with her eyes wide. It was an odd article, much different from the ones Izuku normally saw. It seemed that several villains were attacking the same two children in broad daylight. They seemed desperate, using their quirks and firing guns in public. Yet, before the heroes arrived, those villains had been taken down while the two little girls went on their merry way. According to one witness, this guy who had a quirk that drained people of their stamina fell to the ground after getting jabbed in the stomach with her pinky. Another told the story of how three figures tried to ambush the two only to end up on the ground clutching their stomachs. The only connection that all these villains seemed to have were the masks they wore. There was even a picture some random passerby had taken of the two little girls from their phone. Not a very good picture, as it only showed the backs of the two girls in question. But, while most people wouldn't be able to figure out who it was, neither Izuku nor Toru could mistake Kana's hairstyle, horns, or her tail. Sure enough, when the pair got home, Kana was waiting for them in the living room, along with another little girl who was trying her best to hide behind her. Before Kana even introduced them to Irise, Izuku's eyes had seen enough to notice the signs that a great deal of harm had been done to her. The bandages on her arms and legs were one thing, but there was also the way her entire body shook as she looked at them, with fear clearly evident in those eyes. "You noticed it as well, didn't you, Mr. Midoriya?" said Toru after they had finished lightly questioning the two, giving the duo their side of the story about their day. Now they sat at the kitchen table, cups of warm tea placed before them as Kana was watching something on the television with Eri. "That girl has been through something horrible." "Yeah," said Izuku before taking a sip of his tea. "Though, I'm surprised you noticed." "True. Most humans I've met over the years have reacted that way when they bear witness to a superior being like myself," replied Toru. "Usually, it's a knight or warrior who thought themselves powerful enough to take one of my kind on, only for all that bravery to be replaced with absolute terror once they realize just how inferior they are before us. Other times it's a peasant who came across our path. Honestly, they're the smarter ones as they try their best not to irritate us. In the end, it's all the same as they all cower in fear before a mighty and superior dragon." Then, Toru looked away. "But that doesn't mean I haven't seen that look while in this form. There was a time where I made a horrible mistake traveling with this one gluttonous dragon. One day, we were stopping by a stall to get her bottomless stomach some sweets, and there just so happened to be a slave market across the street. That's when I saw it for the first time, a slave cowering in fear when I looked at them even in this form. I later found out through that glutton that they had most likely been abused by their previous masters, tortured for amusement day after day." "That's horrible," cried Izuku. He was then about to ask if they helped the slaves, but bit his tongue. Given how Toru saw most humans, he had a feeling he wouldn't like the answer she would give. "On that we can agree, Mr. Midoriya," said Toru. The maid then turned to look over at Eri. "Still, we will need to decide how we are going to handle this situation. Based on what I have seen on your television programs, the correct move would be to take her to the police." "That," began Izuku, but paused as he mulled over the situation. For a moment or two he remained still, looking down at the table. Then, when he lifted his head, there was a firm look in his eyes as he spoke. "Normally, I would agree that taking Eri to the police would be the correct decision. But if whoever took her was desperate enough to try and capture her on the streets in full view of the public, it makes me wonder just how far they'd go. I can honestly see them staking out the police departments across the area, looking for any signs of her. And I wouldn't put it past them to break in to find more information or launch an all-out attack. Sending her to the heroes is another option, but I don't know how many have the resources needed in order to take care of her or would have safe rooms up and ready for her." Izuku then took a breath. "But I think there is a bigger issue beyond keeping her physically safe. Based on what Eri has told us, I think she's been held captive for most of her life. We're probably the first people she had ever positively bonded with. Or, at the very least, Kana. Ripping her away from the first potential friend she's had in ages and being thrown into another area full of adults might do more emotional damage. Honestly, I'm afraid that she might begin to fear that any happiness she finds will be ripped away sooner or later. So, maybe it would be a good idea for her to stay with us." Began Toru as she crossed her arms over her chest. "It certainly wouldn't be too much trouble taking care of her." However, the dragon maid's eyes then narrowed as she turned to look at Eri. "I don't like the idea of having another woman in the house. Especially one that could become attached to you, Mr. Midoriya." "What do you take me for, Toru?" asked Izuku, having anticipated this response. "I'm only suggesting this because I know just how reliable you are. That you can handle this no sweat." At that, Toru's cheeks began to turn a slight shade of red. "Are really?" she asked. "Of course," continued Izuku. "I mean, who would be more suited to protect her? A human hero or a mighty dragon? In fact, we have 3 dragons living here. Can you think of any place safer? Pretty sure it would be like a group of dragons protecting an egg." As Izuku took a sip of tea, he missed how Toru's face went nuclear red. While he had only meant it as an expression, 3 dragons protecting a regular egg. Toru had taken the comment much differently. That they would be protecting Eri like she was their egg. Their child. A child with Mr. Midoriya. Toru screamed internally before a perverted grin appeared on her face. Perhaps I can use this to my advantage. If I can show Mr. Midoriya my superior mothering skills, then maybe he'll consider having our own egg. One that we created during a night of unbridled passion that humans simply cannot comprehend. As Toru then looked towards Arita, her smile vanished slightly. Besides, I can't simply kick her out now. Even if she is an inferior human, she has been through enough suffering. With the matter settled, the dragons of the Midoriya household set to work taking care of their newest resident. The first thing Toru and Eri did was take Eri to the bathroom. There, the two began to remove the bandages before giving the single-horned girl a bath. While they were doing this, Izuku went through his old things that were boxed up in his room's closet. Thankfully, his mother had kept his old All Might onesie even after all these years. With the outfit in hand, he brought it to the bathroom before loudly announcing that he was leaving something for Eri to wear by the door. When they finally stepped out, Izuku smiled when he saw Eri wearing it with a blush on her face. The outfit looked a little snug on her, and she couldn't pull up the hood due to her long hair, but it would do for now. It was certainly better than that old hospital gown. This is only temporary, Izuku said in what he hoped was a reassuring tone as he began to pat the little girl's head. Just give us a little time, and we'll be able to take you out to get something that fits better. While Eri remained quiet, she did nod her head. With that done, Toru made her way back to the kitchen to continue working on dinner. In a short while, she had managed to make them all a plate of omelet. Eri, for her part, only stared at the dish for a moment before looking up at everyone else who had begun digging in. As if realizing it was safe to eat, she picked up a spoon before clearly imitating them, scooping up a spoonful of the dish before placing it into her mouth. As soon as she did this, her eyes widened before tears began to form. Eri, what's wrong? Asked Izuku as he stood up. He looked at her, fearful that she might have burnt her tongue or something else. But before he could begin asking 1,000 questions, Eri just shook her head to signal that nothing was wrong. It tastes really good, whispered Eri before eating another spoonful. Of course it does, stated Toru. It was made by yours truly, and everything that I make is simply the best. Why? Because I just so happen to be the world's greatest, most charming, and humble maid. Everything I make is simply the best. Mere humans just can't compete on my level. Go ahead and praise me more. So yummy, whispered Eri as she ate. Once dinner was finished, Izuku went to help Kana with her Japanese history homework, while the new white-haired girl watched on in fascination. At the same time, Toru was singing her cleaning destruction song, as Izuku liked to call it, while she did the dishes. Everything was peaceful until a sudden knock on their door caught their attention. Coming, said Toru in a sing-song voice, moving to the door and opening it. There, standing in front of her, was a man wearing a plague doctor mask with white gloves on his hands. Toru's friendly smile vanished, her face becoming neutral, while the man gazed at her with eyes that believed that she was something beneath his notice. Then, slowly, he took off one of his gloves. That girl has caused me a lot of trouble, said the man, more to himself than to the maid. Thankfully, she was not too far from my reach. Now to clean up the mess. With that, he reached out a hand towards Toru's shoulder, only for the maid to grab his wrist. A bloodlust filled her eyes as she added a tiny amount of pressure to her grip, breaking every bone in her grasp. The man then fell to his knees, tears forming in his eyes as he tried to scream. But he couldn't due to the magic circle that was hovering just in front of his mouth. I can smell it on you. The blood of Eri, growled Toru in a low tone that only the man before her could hear. You can try and hide it with all those chemicals you inferior humans created, but the scent is so ingrained into your body that it can never be hidden from me, and I can tell exactly what you were doing to her. Tell me, did it make you feel all big and powerful cutting up a little girl? How utterly pathetic. Overhaul tried to scream something out, but the words wouldn't come. Not even a sound escaped his throat, as the maid's eyes seemed to glow yellow, while her arm became more dragon-like. But that's not your grievous sin, you filthy human. You dared to touch me with those hands. Only Mr. Midoriya is allowed to do that, growled Toru, her jaw transforming now so that her teeth had grown into massive fangs. Overhaul was beyond panicking now, desperately trying to remove his other glove by using the floor to try and peel it off. This ended when the maid's tail slammed down onto it with enough force that massive cracks could be seen on the floor. The man screamed in silent pain, unable to look at the bloody paste that had been his other hand. He just kept his eyes locked on the maid as she opened her jaws in a manner that didn't seem physically possible. Meanwhile, those at the table heard the growl along with a few other muffled sounds that made them all look up. It sounded a bit like a chomping noise along with a few other noises. Then, there was a moment of silence before the sound of the door closing could be fully heard as Toru made her way back to the kitchen. I swear, salesmen these days are getting more and more pushy, she complained. Just won't take no for an answer. Shrugging, Izuku went back to helping Kana with her homework, as though nothing had happened. None of them noticed when Toru leaned near the trash can to spit out the plague doctor mask, before dumping more trash on top of it. Midoriya, there's something I need to say to you, said Tsu. Izuku let out a hum as he looked at the frog girl sitting next to him on the bus. It was currently the day after Toru's not-so-little break-in at the school, with classes continuing as normal. Today, 1A's heroic lesson would be focusing on the topic that most excited Izuku, rescue. To make things even better, they would be heading towards a special off-campus facility. Seeing as UA was the type of school to pull out all the stops for every training scenario, the entire class was excited to see what they had in store for them this time. What's more, Aizawa had told them that there would be 3 teachers supervising them. Himself, All Might, and one other. After the announcement had been made, and everyone had changed into their hero costumes, Izuku and his vice rep Yaoyorozu led everyone towards the bus. During this time, Momo was very curious about Toru. It became very clear that Yaoyorozu had wanted to ask so many questions about her since yesterday. Though, strangely, it wasn't about how Toru had broken into the school or anything like that. She just had questions on how she had come into his service. Had he gone through an agency or put up a job request online? Did he conduct an interview process? And if he did, what was her formal training like? Was her attire the standard of what maids who served the middle class wore? Izuku did his best to answer these questions, and more as Yaoyorozu looked at him with sparkling eyes, full of wonder and curiosity. Thankfully, the barrage of questions ended as soon as the last student boarded the bus. When that happened, they confirmed it with Aizawa, who simply nodded before all 3 of them made their way onto the vehicle. Once inside, their teacher gave them a firm warning to be on their best behavior before pulling out his sleeping bag and getting into it. Though Izuku didn't think he had much to worry about as the atmosphere during the ride so far had been light-hearted and upbeat. Mainly everyone was relaxing on the bus, with a few people chatting in low tones, as they wondered what they were going to be doing today, as well as speculating on who else was going to be teaching them. Sure. What is it, Tsu? Asked Izuku, noticing movement out of the corner of his eyes as he spoke. The first had been their pink-skinned classmate Mina Ashido. As soon as Tsu had spoken, her head snapped towards the pair with a hungry look in her eyes, like she was expecting some juicy gossip material. And she wasn't the only one watching the 2 greenettes. Both Kaminari and Mainta also turned their attention to the pair with clear jealousy in their eyes. If Tsu noticed this, she didn't seem to show it. Instead, his froggy friend averted her eyes downwards and away from him. like she was having second thoughts about what she had been about to say. Then, after taking a breath to steel herself, she lifted her eyes once more so that they became locked with Midoriya's. I guess it's more of a question. Ribbit, Sue amended. Are you going to be okay today? With All Might teaching again? For a moment, Izuku's eyes widened before it was his turn to avert his gaze as he recalled the last time that he and the symbol of peace had been in a room together. That had been during the battle trail. What's more, he recalled their last conversation together. Or rather, the lack thereof. When he and the other 3 students who had taken part in the first exercise of the class had walked into the monitoring room, it was to find the rest of the class waiting with nervous energy, while All Might had seemed uneasy. After coughing into his fist, the pro hero asked the class to analyze how the 2 teams performed as well as to pick the MVP of the match. Once Yaoyorozu had finished doing most of the talking, mainly stating that the hero team came in with a plan while the villains were careless and unorganized, All Might gave his own limited thoughts. Though no one missed just how short he had been with Izuku, already turning his back to the class as he spoke. After that, Japan's top hero never said another word towards Midoriya. Even though he knew he was most likely at fault, Izuku couldn't help but feel the sting of pain at having his hero reject him like this. It'll be all right, said Izuku after shaking his head before turning to look at Sue with what they both knew was a forced smile. I mean, he's not going to be the only teacher, so maybe I won't interact with him. As he spoke, Izuku could see that Sue's expression didn't change, which wasn't really surprising as he knew she had difficulty expressing herself due to the nature of her quirk. But he could see her shoulders relaxing a bit while her body seemed to become less stiff in her seat. No doubt she was still worried, but less so now after hearing her friend's point of view. TCH. Must be killing a shitty All Might nerd like yourself, came a loud comment from Bakugo, drawing the attention from everyone on the bus. Almost as one, they turned to look at their explosive classmate, who sat there with his arms crossed over his chest, his head held high with a smug look on his face. Being in the same room and not being able to fawn all over him. Guess even All Might knows just how worthless you are. As everyone continued to stare and process what the ashen blonde said, Zero snorted loudly. That's rich coming from you, man, commented the tape quirk user. Even with all that firepower, you still couldn't scratch Midoriya during the battle trail. What did you say, tape dispenser? Raged Bakugo, his eyes going white as he leapt forward and grabbing the back of the seat in front of him. Zero just let out another laugh, adding more fuel to the fire by calling the blonde a toddler. Then, while Bakugo continued to scream his head off, the tape user grew a thoughtful expression. It is pretty weird though, continued Zero, a hand under his chin as he ignored Bakugo completely. It's pretty obvious that All Might doesn't like you. Even someone like Kaminari could see it even after he fried his brain. Hey dude. Not cool, cried Kaminari. But he was like that as soon as he saw you in class, said Zero, continuing as if Kaminari had never spoken. Sure, you can be a little weird with your mumbling and note-taking, but other than that you seem like a pretty okay guy. So I wonder what the deal is with All Might. Was your father some major villain that he took down, or are you his secret illegitimate love child? As soon as he heard love child, Todoroki's head snapped away from the window. He eyed Midoriya, as if using this new information to see him in a new light. Double what? Midoriya almost screamed at the top of his lungs, his eyes becoming nothing more than large, white saucers while the teen's body went rigid. How could they even consider him being an illegitimate love child a possibility? They looked nothing alike. That sounds like something from a soap opera, cried Mina as she stood up, her dark eyes somehow sparkling with excitement. As the pink-skinned teen began bouncing in her seat, she began looking at everyone as she began talking animatedly with her hands balled into fists. All Might, in a moment of pure primal weakness, succumbs to his urges one night in a secret love affair with Midoriya's mother. Time passed. both moving on with their lives while keeping the matter buried in their memories. That is until one day Midoriya's mother discovers that she is pregnant. Knowing who the father is, she insists he take responsibility for the child and be a part of his life. However, All Might clings to the old school logic that should anyone ever find out that he has a family, that they will become a target, thus distancing him from them. But she won't let that stand, so, in a final act of desperation, demands that All Might take some form of responsibility, or else she will blackmail him by going to the press. Feeling trapped, All Might agrees. Years pass, and that feeling of bitterness continues to grow. So now that they're both here at UA, All Might is taking out all his frustrations out on Midoriya. It was then that the words finally sank into Ashido, since all her excitement died, her hands moving to cover her mouth. Tears formed in her eyes as she lunged over to Izuku. "It'll be okay, Midoriya." She began to cry while hugging the dragon. Not that he seemed to notice, as Izuku appeared to become frozen in time. As Ashido continued to wail, sorry for bringing up painful memories, his mind just continued to play what she and Siro had said through a loop. As for the rest of the people on the bus, well, most of them had also been stunned by what the carefree girl had said. And by the time Izuku snapped out of it, he could see several of them contemplating this theory. It was an utterly insane theory, one that belonged on a conspiracy theory blog. But now that they had heard the students were mulling it over, Mainta was one of them, clearly believing that the All Might had to have been getting some action when he wasn't in action. Then there was Takoyami, of all people, who whispered something about there being darkness in everyone's hearts. Todoroki was just staring at Izuku with something akin to understanding, while Siro just said that it makes sense given how nervous All Might got sometimes whenever reporters tried to talk about his love life. "Oh no. No, thought a panicking Izuku. "If I don't deal with this now, then these rumors might spread. If I let that happen, it'll be harder to deal with them, and some might actually believe it. Everyone is going to get mad at All Might for something that's my fault. And if All Might hears this, then he'll be even madder at me." So, after taking a breath, Izuku gently pushed a still crying Ashido off of him. Then, ignoring how wet his chest was from all her tears, he gestured for everyone to listen. "Look, I'm thankful that you're all worried about me," he said in a tone loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I think I know why All Might is acting this way towards me. And it's not because my father is a villain or I'm his secret love child. The thing is, we sort of met over a year ago completely by accident. It didn't, let's just say that he might be under the impression that I lied to him about something important. So he's probably just really mad about that. And I haven't been able to set the record straight with him." A new uneasy tension filled the air. Everyone, including Bakugo, became curious as to what had been said during this meeting. After all, what could Izuku Midoriya have said or done to make All Might that angry with him? Some might have wanted to ask, but one look at Midoriya's body posture showed that he was uncomfortable even saying this much. Well, all but one who was determined to get to the bottom of this. Soon enough, Wano was brought into the Yasuji. Instantly, Aizawa crawled out of his sleeping bag before telling everyone to not waste time getting off the bus. Izuku was about to lead the class, but the hand of Tsu landing on his shoulder stopped him. For several long moments he stared into her eyes as everyone else left the bus. And while Izuku himself didn't see it, Aizawa had lingered by the door for a moment longer as he appraised the situation. Then, before he left the bus and saw that Tsu had noticed him, he held up 4 fingers before exiting the bus, leaving the two alone to talk in private. "Okay, Midoriya, now I can't just let this go." "Ribbit," began Tsu quickly. "You're the biggest All Might fan I've ever met. But in all the time I've known you, you've never once mentioned meeting him. So, please, tell me what happened." For a moment, Izuku stared at his friend dead in the eyes. For a half-second, he seriously considered just brushing it off. Just saying something like it was private, and that there was no need to worry. However, as he continued to look in those eyes, He could see the worry and concern she had for him. A friend. One he didn't want to lose or alienate. One he knew he could trust with pretty much anything that wasn't dragons or real related. So maybe he should tell her the truth. At least the parts he was comfortable with. And perhaps this would be for the best. Sue had a really level head, giving him honest advice whenever asked. So maybe she might know a better way to handle this situation. Okay, he said at last, sighing as he did. It happened before I started getting sick. I was having a bad day. Like a really, really bad day that just got worse when I was attacked by a random villain. Honestly, I thought that was going to be my end. Dying under some random bridge with anyways. All Might got there at the last possible moment and saved me. He even signed my notebook before waking me up. But after making sure I was okay, he said he had to go. Only, I didn't want him to go. I had a question I had to ask. So before I knew what I was doing, I grabbed hold of his leg right before he leapt into the air. Of course you would do something like that, said Sue. While her face remained neutral, there was a hint of amusement in her tone. Well, All Might wasn't too happy that I endangered myself like that, continued Izuku. So he landed on top of a roof so I could get off. But before he could leave, I shouted my question. I wanted to know if a quirkless person like myself could ever become a hero. At that, Tsu's eyes widened in shock, while her mouth hung open slightly while Izuku just looked away. Midoriya, you were… I don't understand, was all Tsu could manage to say as she processed this new information. You have a quirk. Tsu, have you ever wondered why Kaken calls me Deku? Asked Izuku. Or why he tried ripping off my wings when he saw me again? It wasn't because I discovered a new part of my quirk or trained with it to become stronger. It's because, back when we went to school together, I didn't have one. I was quirkless. And as far as I knew, I would always be quirkless. Izuku then sighed. But despite that, I wanted to be a hero just like All Might. I never really aspired to get to the very top like he was. I just wanted to make people feel reassured when they saw me, knowing that because I was there everything would be all right. It was a dream that no one believed in. Not my parents, not my friends, and not even All Might when I asked him. He just told me it wasn't possible before walking away. His last words being it's not wrong to have a dream, just make sure it's realistic. That's when I was at my lowest. How? Began Sue only to stop herself. She took a moment to gulp before continuing. How bad was it? Izuku couldn't turn to look her in the eyes. I was just about to give up on everything, was all he could say to that. Then I got sick. When it began, it was nothing like what you saw when I transferred to our middle school. It was so much worse. Later I understood that it was my quirk coming in, altering my body over a period of time. My best guess is that it was either me being a late bloomer or some sort of weird quirk awakening. I've read that during extreme circumstances that a quirk can radically change in order to preserve the life of the person. Normally this happens when a person's life is in danger, or they go through extreme emotions. Izuku then paused for a moment to let out a sigh, feeling a little guilty about lying to his friend. Well, it wasn't all a lie. He had done the research quirk awakenings back when he had started middle school. At the time, there was a theory going around about it being possible that a quirkless person born from parents who had quirks could awaken a quirk through the normal process by which people normally through quirk awakening. However, given how rare these situations work, as well as how immense the physical or psychological trauma would have to be, no ethically sound studies could be made. In fact, most people never even considered it a possibility. The only reason Izuku had brought it up now was because he had been talking with Tsu, as he remembered just how depressed he had been that night. Still, he knew there were things he couldn't tell her, like the truth behind his illness. Honestly, he didn't know how she would react. Heck, it took him a while to wrap his head around the fact that Toru was a real dragon. How would someone like Tsu or anyone else in the world handle it? and then going into the fact that Toru had been cutting off parts of her tail meat and cooking it just so he could get a quirk would more than likely make people think he was some sort of insane freak. Then there were the little bits about All Might. It was a given. There were certain things he couldn't say about the hero, like his injury. He had also kept his peace about the most painful part of it all. How All Might left him standing there on that roof all alone after shattering the last bit of hope he had left. While Tsu was a level-headed person, he felt like she would be more upset with that than anything he said. "So All Might is mad at you because he thinks you lied to him?" asked Tsu. Slowly, Izuku turned to look at her, finding a rare frown on her face. "That's my best guess," replied Izuku. "I bet he thinks that I interrupted his hero work and endangered myself all for a silly prank. The school knows that I used to be quirkless, but I don't know if they told All Might or not." "Well," began Tsu as Aizawa knocked on the side of the bus, signaling the pair that time was up. As Tsu stood up, there was a determined look in her eyes. "I think he's taking it too far. Ribbit." With that said, the pair left the bus to find everyone waiting for them at the gate of the USG. There their homeroom teacher stood, gesturing to them to hurry up. Together, the two friends joined the rest of the class as they entered the building, where they were then met by none other than the Pro Hero 13. Seeing a pro hero he had never met before in the flesh caused many of the depressing feelings Izuku had been feeling to flee for their lives, as he began a fast-paced ramble about the space-themed hero. One joined by an excited Uraraka, who seemed to beam towards the green-haired dragon boy, who began to rattle on the details of one of her favorite heroes. This continued as the class entered the USG, and, while the class marveled at all the different zones it held, Aizawa called the space-themed hero over to the side to talk more privately. "Where's All Might?" asked the tired-looking man once he was sure that no one would overhear them. "He's supposed to be here? Don't tell me the fool booked an interview or got held up signing autographs." "No," replied 13 as she held up 3 fingers. "He's at UA, resting. Apparently, he accidentally used up his 3 hours this morning." "Accidentally, you say?" said Aizawa slowly as he shot a look over to Midoriya. What none of them knew was that he had been awake for the entire trip here, listening to every word they said. And while he had not eavesdropped on the conversation between the Midoriya and Isui, he had an educated guess on what they talked about. It had been the entire reason he had allowed them private time. Given what he had heard from Midoriya on the ride here, the way Isui looked when they had gotten off, along with how the big oaf had been acting up to this point, painted a picture that Aizawa found distasteful, making him wonder if All Might had intentionally used up his time just so that he wouldn't be here with Midoriya. Well, whatever the case, Aizawa couldn't interfere at this moment. Not until either All Might did something seriously grievous right in front of him or Midoriya launched a formal complaint in person. He only hoped that Isui could convince Midoriya to do so, for his own sake. At that moment, All Might was in his skinny form within the privacy of the teacher's lounge. He sat there on the couch with his head down, bony fingers covering his face so that no one would notice the dark circles around his eyes. He understood something was wrong with him. It was keeping him up at night, tossing and turning in his bed, preventing sleep from taking hold. It was making him sloppy, briefly wondering if he had used up his limited hero time, subconsciously just to avoid the problem. Not like that was easy to do, since every time he closed his eyes the images came rushing back to him. The sight of Midoriya standing there as a massive explosion raced toward him. He didn't even notice what was happening right in front of his eyes until it was too late. Young Midoriya could have been killed under his watch. The pro hero wanted to cry. He had almost allowed that boy to die just because he was being paranoid. Sure, it was odd that the boy suddenly acquired a quirk, but there was no reason to jump to such extremes. There was no proof that All for One was still alive. He had flattened the man's face, so of course the man shouldn't be alive. His friends had even checked and spoken to the boy, while one of his closest friends used his quirk to see if the boy was lying. Why didn't he believe them? With each breath All Might took, the more he began to realize just how foolish he had been. There was no way All for One would have made young Midoriya a spy. It would have been too obvious. Slowly, All Might glanced at the door, which remained closed. A part of him had expected Nezu to have walked in by now to chastise him for not taking his duty as a teacher more seriously. To remind him why he was here, looking for his successor along with teaching the next generation. But the principal hadn't said a word to him since the battle trail with 1A. No doubt he was still trying to figure out how to handle the situation. And for a genius like Nezu to be taking this long, it probably didn't bode well. However, regardless of what Nezu planned to say or do, All Might knew what needed to be done first. Talk to young Midoriya. An honest apology from him, and hopefully clearing the air between the two. I might be able to make it before the rescue lesson ends, thought All Might as he nodded firmly to himself. I'm already pushing myself in that form. But if I can manage to talk to young Midoriya in private, then it won't matter. It might be better that way. X. Little did All Might know that that lesson was already cancelled due to a villain assault. Everything had happened so fast. One moment, Aizawa's class was listening to 13 as she spoke on the dangers of quirks, and then next a portal opened allowing dozens of villains to enter the SG grounds. Aizawa was the first to act, telling 13 to get the kids to safety while he dealt with their foes. However, as soon as the underground hero left, the floor beneath the feet of the heroes in training became covered in darkness. Greetings, we are the League of Villains, said a villain who seemed to rise from the darkness itself. Shadows and darkness seemed to cover its body almost like a cloak or costume, save for the two yellow eyes that seemed to look down at the group despite the politeness in his tone. We have entered these hallowed halls of heroics in order to kill All Might. Sadly, it seems our intel was wrong. Oh well. Without another word, the ground beneath the students' feet seemed to vanish, as they were all dropped into a seemingly unending abyss. The next thing Izuku knew was he was underwater. Glancing around in confusion, he spotted Uraraka as she thrashed about as large bubbles of air escaped her mouth. All thoughts other than saving one of his friends were pushed out of the teen's mind, ignoring the villains who swam towards him at high speed. With a flap of his wings, Izuku pushed himself through the water, as his body glowed a bright green before transforming into his dragon form. Not that the villains realized as for them. One moment the kid they were about to kill was glowing, and then the next they all got knocked away by a giant tail. Thanks to his dragon form, Izuku was able to ensure Uraraka's safety as she found herself on the top of his head before the two became airborne over the water. Flapping his wings, Midoriya hovered in the air looking down at the water rescue training area, while the girl he saved remained on her hands and knees as she coughed out water. As Izuku gave her time, he noticed what looked like dozens of aquatic villains slowly coming up to the surface with their mouths agape at what they saw. "Does Rukyu have a little brother?" shouted one of the villains. However, his question was only met with silence as the rest continued to process what they were seeing. They had been told that they were going to be dealing with a group of kids that had less than a week of training under their belts. Sure, their quirks were strong and impressive enough to get them into the top hero school in the country. But with their numbers and them separated, they should have been easy pickings. But now, as they stared up at Izuku, they felt less sure about their odds, especially given how he had just knocked several of their group out with just a swipe of his tail. Meanwhile, up in the air, Izuku let out a thankful sigh as he spotted his other classmates. There, near a boat in the middle of the man-made lake, was Tsu helping both Sato and Ida into a boat. He also spotted Mainta, who was already on the boat, as he cowered in a corner. "Deku, where's the rest of the class?" asked Uraraka, her lungs finally free of foreign substances. Izuku didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his attention towards the rest of the SG. Almost instantly, he noticed several explosions coming from an area that looked like a city that had just suffered an earthquake, followed by loud curses that he picked up with his enhanced dragon hearing. "Looks like Kakin is safe," said Izuku, his tone indicating that he was not concerned. Over in the landslide area, the dragon team could see waves of ice being formed. Unless the villains had a powerful ice quirk user with them, then it was most likely Todoroki. "I think they're scattered all over the Usji," Izuku said at last. "What should we do?" asked Uraraka. "We need to regroup. But how would we?" While flying in the air, Izuku Midoriya began a massive muttering spree. His words seemed to go a mile a minute, small bits of green flames escaping his maw from time to time as he spoke. His eyes darted around, taking in everything. They needed to get to everyone. Well, that was covered, as Izuku could fly to all the areas and bypass all the villains. But the problem was how to transport them. He was big, but he didn't know if he could carry 20 people on his back. 22 if he included Aizawa, and 13. He could take his classmates from the various zones, drop them off at the exit, and go back for more. But that would leave those he left behind open to attack, or else being sent back to the villains by that warping villain. He needed something. Looking back down at his classmates, his eyes widened in realization. "I have a plan," exclaimed Izuku. "Uraraka, I might need your help." Without waiting to hear the brunette's reply, Izuku flew down to the boat, where he dropped Uraraka off next to his friends. Once she was safe and sound, the dragon team grabbed the boat with his claws before lifting it out of the water. It didn't take long for his classmates to realize what he was planning, Uraraka helping out by removing gravity's hold upon the ship. The others braced themselves for whatever may come their way, save Mainta, who just continued to cry. Now airborne, Izuku took them from zone to zone. Each time he let out a mighty roar like he had during the entrance exam that altered everyone to his presence. Thankfully, his classmates got the message, doing their best to single the flying dragon. The hardest had been, of course, Bakugo, who needed to be dragged onto the boat kicking and screaming. "No!" screamed Bakugo as he fought against the hold Kirishima had him in. "There's no way I'm going along with Deku's plan. I can get out of here all on my..." The teen was then cut off by an exasperated Siro, who tapped the teen's mouth shut. Soon enough, Izuku had gathered all of his classmates along with the pro hero 13 who had been in Yaoyorozu's group. Yet, despite the good time they had made, Uraraka was reaching her limit. Her face was looking greener, hands over her stomach as she looked over the edge. It was clear that she could vomit at any moment. Izuku was thankful there was only one person left to get, Aizawa. And while getting him out of there without directly engaging the villains would be tough, it wasn't impossible. As soon as they flew over the main courtyard, Izuku called out to both the vice rep and the grape-themed pervert. As they flew over the villains, Mainta began throwing his sticky purple orbs down at the masses, many of them striking the villains on some part of their body, rendering their limbs mostly useless when they tried to remove them. A few even stuck their legs to the ground, making them immobile for the time being. As for Yaoyorozu, she was creating flashbangs and sticky foam grenades which she tossed overboard. But that didn't mean that the villains were just taking it lying down. Those who were not fighting Aizawa or unconscious turned their attention to the flying boat. Several of the long-range attackers fired upon the ship. While they managed to get a few hits in, Takoyami was able to block several of the shots thanks to Dark Shadow, while Kirishima used his hardened body to take a few hits. Even Bakugo decided to help out, taking out his pent-up frustration by knocking away objects flying towards them with his explosions. If only that's where it ended. The mist villain who had separated them returned, multiple warp portals appearing all around them. Izuku had to constantly dodge them, roughly jerking the boat side to side and almost knocking his classmates off their feet to avoid being sent somewhere far worse. While he was avoiding those portals, from the ones above their heads came more villains who leapt out towards the hero class. This, however, became a treat for Izuku as he got to see 13 in action. The space hero moved to the side of the boat, where she activated Black Hole, pulling the villains in her direction before deactivating the quirk. Those she ensnared zoomed away from the boat and towards the ground below. As for the rest of the class, they helped out with any the pro hero missed. Sato and Ojiro were able to use their close-range combat skills to knock out whoever they could, along with Kaminari, who acted like a living taser. Unfortunately, due to all the shaking and overuse of her quirk, was putting a toll on Uraraka. More than once, she vomited rainbows over the side of the ship, which fell on the villains below. Yet still, despite being well over her limit, she refused to let gravity take hold of the ship once more. Not until they were all safe. It took longer than Izuku would have liked, but eventually they reached where Aizawa was fighting. Midoriya shouted to Takoyami and Shiro, both of them understanding what to do without being told. The underground hero looked upward, panting heavily as the boat shot towards him. As it passed, he felt tape attaching itself to his back, while a dark shadow grabbed up. Both lifted him upwards while the boat gained distance away from the ground. This is such an insane, reckless plan, thought Aizawa as he was pulled up. It would have been more rational for Midoriya to escape and go for help. Just then, Aizawa's feet made contact with the ship. Instantly he looked around, making a quick tally of everyone who was there. No one had been left behind. Everyone was safe, and, most importantly, unharmed. Seeing this caused a bit of pride to appear. But if he had, then there would have been a greater chance that not everyone would be making it out of this. Seems like no one is hurt. No, Namu, don't let them escape. Izuku blinked when he heard the words screamed behind him. But before he could fully process what he had heard, the world seemed to slow down for everything but him, and one other. A dark-skinned creature with an exposed brain and a beak had jumped into the air so that he was now high above the boat. Midoriya watched as it punched the air behind it, rocketing down towards the boat. If something didn't happen, then it would either crash into or destroy the boat before his classmates even knew what was happening. The only other one who seemed to realize what was going on was Aizawa, whose eyes began to glow red while his hair stood on end. But despite this, nothing seemed to happen. The creature did not slow down, nor did the massive amount of muscle that it had seemed to deflate. What's more, Aizawa looked like he was getting ready to fight, but thanks to Midoriya's enhanced senses, he could tell that his homeroom teacher would be too slow to react in time. So that left. Guys, I'm sorry for this. With that thought, Izuku chucked the boat forward before flying upward to fight Namu. As the boat flew through the air, Shiro acting quickly as he used his tape to keep his classmates from flying off the deck before it crashed through the doors of the Uschi and into freedom, Midoriya bit into the Namu. Or rather, he tried to. Somehow Namu was holding his jaw open with his bare hands. Feeling panicked, the green-haired teen began thrashing his head in every direction until the Namu was flung off and sent downwards. Now nervous, Izuku watched as the black-skinned monster crashed into the ground below, creating a large crater in the process. The teen was only able to take a single breath before the monster shot up from the ground, appearing before him again with a fist pulled back and its tongue hanging out. A sudden blow connected with Izuku's snout, one with enough force that he was sent spiraling away from the gate and towards the other side of the Uschi where the ruined city landscape was. With a wince and a groan, Izuku rose from the rubble that had been 3 office buildings caused by his crash landing. Much like a dog, he shook off the debris while ignoring the slight throbbing on his snort. As he did this, Izuku could hear a small voice inside of him protest, demanding that he lie back down. That if he played dead, then he wouldn't have to fight that thing. But Izuku knew that, if he did that, then there was a good chance that the villains would order that monster to go after the rest of his class. There was no way he was going to let that happen. So, instead, Izuku let out a roar so loud that it almost shook the entire Uschi. Upon hearing the sound, Namu charged at the dragon, running on all fours like a gorilla. Once it was in the same zone, it leapt into the air flying for Izuku. But this time Izuku moved faster to counterattack this monster, grabbing one of the nearby buildings, a tall half-destroyed skyscraper, which he swiftly pulled out of the ground before using it like a makeshift bat. Sadly, Izuku hadn't really thought this plan out very well, as it didn't knock the monster away. Instead, the Namu crashed right through the windows of the building, getting cut up by the glass and various other objects, until it passed through the other side. Feeling foolish, Izuku dropped the building as he turned to face his foe. That's when he saw it. There on the ground, Namu paused as glass and various other items that had impaled the creature were pushed out of its body before the wounds healed at a rapid pace. Not knowing what else to do, Izuku took a deep breath before unleashing a wave of green flames that washed over everything in its path. The Namu took the blast as the building around it melted and evaporated into nothing. When the green flames had subsided, there was a massive V-shaped slab of land within the zone that was now completely flat. The ground itself appeared black and charred, while being spotted by areas that were still glowing red as the earth continued to smolder. There were even some spots where green flames continued to dance along the edges of half-melted pipes. And the only thing to remain standing was the charred figure of the Namu. Yet almost instantly, its skin began to peel off and was replaced by a new layer. Namu, what is taking so long? You should be at a higher level than All Might. Finish that kid. Now. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw the villain who had spoken as he stepped out of a warp gate. Said villain was covered in hands and rainbow vomit. However, the teen didn't have long to dwell on it, as he noticed the other warp portals appearing all around the zone. Through them stepped a massive amount of villains. A growl escaped Izuku's throat as he glanced around, noting how they trembled. For a moment, he wondered why. That is until he heard it. I thought that thing was supposed to take down All Might. But it's having trouble against one kid, whispered one of the villains. That's when Izuku understood. These villains had attacked the Usji thinking that they could kill All Might because they had this monster on their side. And right now, he was crushing that idea. It was probably the reason the villain was focusing on him right now as he presented an obstacle to that vision. Throwing his head back, Izuku let out another mighty roar that caused shock waves to roll around the ground with the giant dragon's body acting like the epicenter. Despite being so far away, many of the villains were pushed back, with some even getting knocked over just from the sheer force as they covered their ears with their hands. What are all of you doing? Screamed the hand and vomit-covered villain, looking ready to begin stomping his foot in frustration. He's one stupid child. Just gang up on him and hit him till he dies. For a moment, none of the villains made a move as they all stared at the giant green dragon before them. It wasn't until one of them, clearly still afraid yet stealing his nerves, managed to let out a roar before charging at the teen, while his hands turned into oversized bear claws. Izuku would have been fascinated by this change, but that quirk nerd in him was pushed to the side as the rest of the villains moved to attack as well. Dozens of people with close-ranged quirks rushed from the corners of the zone. Once they were close enough, they began to attack. A villain with 4 large, rocky fists tried to pummel one of Izuku's toes, while another transformed his hands into blades in order to stab the end of the teen's long, massive tail. Izuku could feel something crawling up his back, someone with a chameleon quirk who had a knife in his maw. As more of these types of villains tried in vain to pierce Izuku's scales, the ranged quirked enemies began to fire off their own attacks. Bullets, fireballs, streams of electricity, and so much more were launched in his direction. Of course, Izuku wasn't just going to stand there and take it. The teen brought his head low to the ground, hind legs raised as he let out another mighty roar that sent nearly all of the villains in front of him flying backwards. He then turned, his tail colliding with many of his attackers much in the same way a bat collides with a baseball. His wings then extended to their full length before they began to beat hard, the wind pressure pushing all of the villains backwards. And as all this was going on, Shigaraki stood there processing what he was seeing. The sight reminded him of Ava. It's like the final boss of an MMORPG fantasy game, cried Shigaraki, as his eyes beheld the sight with childlike wonder. watching the melee DPS players charging at the big boss, attacking him from all sides, while the spellcasters and hunters stayed in the back spamming their attacks. And it was against a dragon. He was living the dream that every hardcore gamer desired: to be in the game itself. "This is the greatest day of my life, Master Shigaraki," said Kurogiri, his tone dripping in polite disapproval. Right, said Shigaraki quickly before correcting himself. "Greatest day of my life so far. When we kill All Might, then it will be the greatest day." At that, Kurogiri let out a sigh as he realized that this might be the best he would get for now. Just then Namu re-entered the fray, as it jumped into the air ready to punch Izuku once more. Thinking fast, Izuku transformed back into his human form, causing the creature to miss. "Downside to being so big is that there's more of you to hit," thought Izuku as he flapped his wings, eyes focused on the real monster before him. For several long minutes, Izuku managed to dodge the Nomu's attacks using his more agile form, as well as his flight, to avoid a direct hit. However, it wasn't easy as, from the sidelines, those with long-ranged quirks continued to fire at him. Most of the time the attacks missed, but there were moments when Izuku felt himself getting pelted by their quirks. Portals appeared around the teen, and, more than once, he saw that hand villain looking like he was making his way through like a horror movie monster. Said villain tried swiping at the dragon, missing but in the process showing what his quirk could do. More than once his hands touched an object, causing it to decay rapidly. Finally, the villain scored a big hit. The Namu shot out of a portal that suddenly appeared right in front of the teen and landed a clean blow to Midoriya's face, sending him crashing down to the ground so hard that a massive crater was formed. As he slowly got up, Izuku rubbed his slightly bruised cheek. He had to admit that while it hurt, Kana punched much harder. "Come on, Namu, kill him already," screamed the hand villain. As the exposed brain monster began to charge at Izuku once more, tongue swaying from side to side as it did, a figure rushed past the shattered gates of the Usji. All Might had finally arrived. Izuku watched as the #1 hero moved through the Usji, knocking down all the villains in what must have been an instant for someone who didn't have enhanced senses. Everyone, save the hand villain, the warping villain, and the Namu. The battle that ensued was intense as All Might discovered, thanks in part to Shigaraki, that the Namu had several quirks. Not only did it have enhanced strength and regeneration, but shock absorption as well. "That explains why my blows weren't as effective against it," thought Izuku as he ignored the winds that were caused by All Might. Winds so powerful that both Shigaraki and Kurogiri seemed to struggle to stay where they were, while Midoriya just stood there as if this was a pleasant breeze. But it looks like All Might has it handled. Since it's shock absorption and not nullification, that means there's a limit to what it can handle. That's why he's increasing the power of his blows and punching more rapidly. No wonder he's the greatest hero in the world. Izuku's eyes began to sparkle with pure adoration as he watched his hero fight with everything. Then, after a minute, All Might landed a punch so powerful that it sent the creature flying into the area. When the Namu hit the roof, the building looked like it was rippling from the force for a moment before it shattered, sending the monster flying through the clouds. Why do I suddenly have the urge to say looks like Team Rocket is blasting off again? Thought Midoriya as he gaped at the hole, Namu becoming a twinkling star in the sky above. With that, the villainous leaders made a quick retreat while leaving behind all of their goons. Once the authorities arrived as well as the rest of the school's heroes, Izuku was checked out by paramedics with healing quirks, while the police spoke to the team. The first thing they told him was that his class was okay. As soon as Izuku got them out, they contacted UA, as well as the other heroes in the area. Hearing that helped Izuku relax before answering their questions. Yet, while he was telling them about when All Might came onto the scene, Izuku couldn't help but feel like something had been off. That All Might seemed to grow agitated when he realized that the Namu had multiple quirks. That, and more than once during the fight, The symbol of peace had looked right at the dragon teen.